Welcome, my friend. You are here at Sleepy Whisper. Before we begin, set your volume to a gentle level, close your eyes, and let your body rest in silence. Together, we will drift into sleep. Tonight, we start our very first story in the series of boring history for sleep: Egyptian farmers and their crops. If you enjoy these calm journeys through time, please remember to like this video and subscribe so you can join us again tomorrow night. Now, let us begin. In the vast and ancient land of Egypt, long before the bustling sounds of modern cities or the rush of technology, there was only the steady rhythm of the river Nile and the people who depended on it for every breath of life. The farmers of ancient Egypt lived their lives according to the cycles of the river, for the Nile was not only a source of water but the very heartbeat of their existence. Each year, without fail, the river would swell with floods, covering the banks with rich, dark soil that carried nutrients from far upstream. This was not seen as a disaster, but as a blessing, for with that layer of fertile silt, the farmers could begin their work of sowing and harvesting the crops that would sustain the people of Egypt. The farmers were not kings, nor generals, nor men of great wealth, but they held a responsibility that was in many ways greater than all others. Without their hands to till the earth, without their patience to wait upon the floods, there would be no bread, no year, no nourishment for the laborers who built temples and pyramids, no sustenance for the scribes who recorded laws, no meals for the pharaoh himself. Life in Egypt was, at its core, tied to the quiet, patient work of farmers. These farmers rose with the sun, the same blazing sun that poured its light over the desert sands and the fertile fields. Their lives were not filled with excitement or glory, but with routine and rhythm. First came the season of flooding, when fields could not be worked. During this time, farmers tended to animals, repaired tools, and offered prayers to the gods for a good season ahead. Then came the time to sow, when seeds of wheat and barley were pressed gently into the damp earth, and flax was scattered for the fibers that would later be woven into linen. The farmers bent low, repeating the same motions day after day, their bodies moving almost in harmony with the land itself. It was slow work, often tedious, yet it held the quiet dignity of knowing that without it, there would be no survival. To help guide water where it was needed, the farmers used simple yet clever tools. One of the most well-known was the shaduf, a long wooden pole balanced on a crossbeam with a bucket at one end and a weight at the other. With it, water could be lifted from canals or the river and poured onto higher ground. Hour after hour, men would pull and release, lift and pour, until the thirsty soil was satisfied. The work was repetitive, but it gave life to the crops. The farmers did not work alone. Families often labored together. Children carried small bundles of seeds. Women helped scatter grain, and men guided plows that were sometimes pulled by oxen. Songs would rise softly in the fields, not lively or festive, but steady, like chants to keep time with the endless work. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the river in shades of red and gold, the farmers would return to their modest homes of mud brick. These homes were simple, built to provide shade from the sun and shelter from the night, yet they were filled with the quiet laughter of families who found contentment in survival. When harvest season came, the work grew more intense. Crops were cut carefully with sickles, often made with flint blades set into wooden handles. The grain was gathered into bundles, carried from the fields, and then threshed by beating or by driving animals across the stalks to separate the grain from the husks. It was dusty work, the air filled with the smell of chaff and the sound of husks being broken apart. Yet it was also a time of relief, for a successful harvest meant that Egypt would have bread for another year, and bread was not only food, but a symbol of life itself. Beer, too, was brewed from barley, and it became a daily drink for farmers, workers, and nobles alike. Thus, the humble work of sowing and harvesting reached every level of society, from the poorest laborer to the throne of the pharaoh. Still, the lives of farmers were not without difficulty. Taxes were collected in grain, and officials often came to measure and take a portion of the harvest. The weight of these demands could be heavy, for even in good years, the farmer's own share was sometimes small. Yet year after year, generation after generation, the farmers returned to the fields, guided by tradition, necessity, and the certainty that their work was essential to Egypt's survival. As the Nile continued its eternal cycle, so too did the farmers continue theirs. shaping not only the land, but the very foundation of Egyptian civilization. The story of Egyptian farmers is not only about planting and harvesting, but also about how they managed to live within the great web of society that depended so heavily on them. In ancient Egypt, every role had its place, and the farmer's place was clear and vital. Yet the life of a farmer was not glamorous. Their clothing was plain, often simple linen garments made from the flax they grew themselves. Men commonly wore kilts, while women wore long dresses that offered some comfort against the heat of the day. Linen was prized for being cool and light, yet it was also a product of long hours of careful cultivation, as flax plants needed to be pulled, soaked, beaten, and spun before being woven into fabric. Just as crops required patient effort, so too did the clothes upon the farmer's back. Daily meals were modest. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley formed the foundation of nearly every diet, often eaten with onions, garlic, or fish from the Nile. Beer, thick and somewhat sour, was consumed regularly, even by children, as it provided both nutrition and hydration in the hot climate. Meat was rare for farmers, reserved mostly for festivals or sacrifices, while milk, cheese, and vegetables supplemented their meals. These simple foods gave strength to the body for the endless cycle of labor, though the meals themselves offered little variety. Still, for the Egyptian farmer, survival was enough, and routine was a form of security. Their homes, built from sun-dried mud brick, were clustered together in villages. These structures were not meant to last forever, but they served their purpose well enough, keeping out the heat of the day and offering shelter from the desert winds at night. Inside, the rooms were plain, often with a small hearth for cooking and mats for sleeping. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a stool or low table, yet families gathered close, bound together by necessity and by tradition. The sound of crickets at night, the murmur of the river nearby, and the flicker of oil lamps filled their evenings with a quiet simplicity that modern life rarely knows. Work was relentless, but it also carried a rhythm shaped by the gods themselves. The Egyptians believed that agriculture was not merely survival, but part of a divine order. The god Osiris, often associated with fertility and crops, symbolized the cycle of death and rebirth seen each year in the flooding and retreating of the Nile. Farmers prayed to him and to other deities, offering small tokens of grain or bread, asking for good floods, healthy harvests, and protection against pests or drought. Religion wove itself into their fields, their homes, and their daily lives, offering meaning to the repetitive tasks they performed. Yet not all was within their control. Locusts could swarm the fields, stripping crops bare in a matter of hours. Droughts could shrink the Nile's flood, leaving fields dry and barren. Too much flooding could wash away carefully sown seeds. At such times, famine and hardship reminded the farmers of their fragile place within nature's balance. Still, they endured, for they had no other choice. To be a farmer in Egypt was to accept uncertainty, to work with patience, and to hope with quiet persistence. Beyond the practical, farming also shaped Egyptian society in ways that reached far beyond the fields. The surpluses produced by farmers allowed craftsmen to make jewelry, builders to construct temples, and scribes to record history. Without the farmers' labor, none of Egypt's greatness, the pyramids, the statues, the temples, would have been possible. Grain was stored in great granaries, guarded and managed by officials, and it often served as currency, exchanged for goods or used to pay workers. In this way, the sweat of the farmer became the wealth of the nation, flowing from humble fields to the highest courts of power. Children were raised to follow in the footsteps of their parents. Boys often began helping in the fields at a young age, learning how to sow seeds, guide animals, and work the shaduf. Girls helped in the household, grinding grain on stone querns, baking bread, or fetching water. Their futures were shaped early, not by ambition but by duty, for the cycle of farming was eternal, passed down generation after generation. Education for most did not mean reading or writing, but learning the silent wisdom of the land. When to plant, when to harvest, how to read the signs of the Nile. These lessons were unwritten but deeply ingrained, as essential to survival as breathing itself. The social status of farmers was humble, often seen as lowly compared to scribes, priests, or soldiers, yet they were indispensable. Ancient texts sometimes acknowledged this, with scribes writing about the harsh life of farmers to remind themselves of their own privilege. But the truth was undeniable. Without farmers, the grand structure of Egypt's society would collapse. Their lives may not have been praised in monuments or recorded in detail by historians, but their silent toil under the sun was as much a foundation of civilization as the stones of the pyramids. As the seasons turned and the Nile rose and fell, the farmers remained steady. Their lives may have seemed monotonous, yet within that monotony lay the very strength of Egypt. They did not seek glory, only the harvest. And in that harvest, they carried not only food, but the future of their land. As we drift further into the life of the Egyptian farmer, it becomes clear that their world was not defined by sudden changes or dramatic events, but by the steady repetition of duties that spanned lifetimes. Each season returned in its turn, and the work repeated itself with only minor variations, yet within this sameness lay a structure that bound the entire civilization together. The agricultural calendar was divided into 3 distinct seasons, each carrying its own demands and rhythms. The first season, known as Akhet, was the season of the inundation, when the Nile overflowed its banks and covered the land with water. During this time, fields were submerged, making planting impossible, so farmers often took on other tasks such as repairing canals, mending tools, or serving in labor projects organized by the state. The second season, Peret, was the season of growth, when waters receded and fields revealed the thick black silt left behind. This was the time of sowing, when farmers spread seeds of wheat, barley, lentils, and flax into the moist earth. The third season, Shemu, was the season of harvest, when the crops ripened and were gathered in great effort before the heat of the sun could ruin them. These 3 cycles repeated endlessly, year after year, generation after generation, forming the framework upon which Egyptian society rested. Within these seasons, each farmer's life followed a similar routine, yet not without its challenges. The Nile was generally predictable, but small differences in its flooding could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity. Too little water led to famine, while too much could wash away fields and villages. Thus, the farmer's existence was tied directly to forces beyond his control, and this dependency shaped not only his work, but also his beliefs. It is no coincidence that the Egyptians honored gods linked to fertility, water, and growth, for their survival was inseparable from these divine powers. The tools of the farmer, though simple, were essential and had changed little over centuries. Wooden plows, sometimes tipped with copper or bronze, were dragged by oxen across the fields, breaking the soil into rows for planting. Hoes and sickles were used to weed and harvest, their shapes designed for endurance rather than speed. Grinding stones turned grain into flour through slow, repetitive motion, most often done by women, whose labor in the home was as constant and demanding as the men's work in the fields. Water management remained a central concern, and so canals and basins were dug to direct and preserve the life-giving flood. The shadaf, that simple lever device for lifting water, became a familiar sight along the banks, its long wooden arm dipping and rising in a motion that must have felt eternal to those who worked it. In this way, technology remained basic but effective, built on human patience rather than mechanical innovation. Taxes were an unavoidable burden that tied the farmer not only to the land, but also to the state. Officials known as scribes traveled through the countryside, measuring fields, counting livestock, and recording expected yields. From these records, a portion of the harvest was claimed as tax, stored in granaries to support the temples, the army, and the pharaoh's projects. Sometimes the burden was heavy, and farmers who could not meet their quota faced harsh punishments or the loss of what little they had. Yet even under this weight, the system endured, for the farmers had little choice but to continue the cycle, sustaining not only their families, but the machinery of the kingdom itself. Family life was deeply tied to farming duties. The household was both a unit of labor and a place of rest. Children were raised not with luxuries, but with responsibilities, learning early how to fetch water, scatter seed, and tend animals. The continuity of this lifestyle meant that knowledge passed smoothly from one generation to the next, with little disruption. A boy learned the rhythm of planting and harvesting by working alongside his father, just as his father had once worked alongside his grandfather. A girl learned the crafts of grinding grain, weaving linen, and preparing meals by watching her mother and grandmother. Thus, the unbroken chain of tradition bound Egyptian farmers not just to the land, but to time itself. While scribes and priests recorded elaborate myths and kings inscribed their victories on temple walls, the farmer's life left little trace in history, beyond what can be read from tools, homes, and the occasional description written by those of higher status. Yet the absence of their voices does not diminish their importance. If anything, it emphasizes how central they were, so ordinary, so constant, that their labor formed the background upon which the grand story of Egypt unfolded. Their names may not be preserved, but their contribution is etched into every loaf of bread that fed a worker, every jar of beer that quenched thirst, every stone raised in the desert sun. At night, when the day's work was finally done, farmers might gather with their families, sharing modest meals and quiet moments of rest. The stars above the desert shone brilliantly, unclouded by smoke or light, and the people may have looked upward with the same mix of wonder and weariness that humans have always felt. Tomorrow would bring the same tasks, the same challenges, the same reliance on the river. But within this sameness lay a stability that allowed Egypt to endure for centuries, a stability rooted in the fields, in the crops, and in the hands of farmers who toiled without rest. To understand the life of the Egyptian farmer more deeply, it is important to see how their work connected with every layer of society, and how their labor, though humble, shaped the very identity of the civilization. Farming was not an isolated occupation, but part of a greater system where the state, the temples, and the people all relied upon the steady production of food. Every loaf of bread eaten by a laborer working on the pyramids, every jar of beer consumed in a festival, every basket of grain stored in a temple granary began in the soil of a farmer's field. The grain was more than nourishment. It was currency, tax, and security against famine. It is often said that Egypt was the gift of the Nile, but in truth, it was also the gift of those who bent their backs beneath the sun, guiding plows, scattering seeds, and harvesting crops with endless patience. The day of a farmer began early, often before sunrise, when the air was still cool and the stars still visible above the desert horizon. Men and women alike rose to prepare for the long hours ahead. Simple tools were gathered, animals were readied, and families moved toward the fields with a rhythm so practiced that it required little thought. The morning would be filled with repetitive actions, guiding oxen, pulling the shaduf, scattering handfuls of seeds into waiting furrows. The sounds of birds along the river and the rustling of reeds mixed with the low voices of people working side by side. These were not sounds of excitement or laughter, but of steady labor, as familiar to them as breathing. The midday sun was harsh, and work slowed under its heat. Farmers often paused to rest in the shade, drinking water or beer and eating small meals of bread, onions, or figs. Children played nearby, though even their games were often tied to work, mimicking the tasks they would one day inherit. By afternoon, the pace picked up again, and the cycle of irrigation, sowing, or tending animals continued until the sun lowered and painted the fields in long golden shadows. Returning home, families gathered in modest mud brick houses that clustered together into villages. These homes rarely had more than a few rooms, with simple mats on the floor and a small hearth for cooking. Walls were decorated not with luxury, but with necessity: storage jars, tools, baskets, and the occasional clay figurine or simple amulet. At night, lamps fueled by oil or fat offered light, and families shared quiet meals before sleep. Life was repetitive, yet the repetition carried with it a sense of continuity, a link to ancestors who had done the same for generations. Farming was not just work, but a cultural identity, a way of life that connected individuals to the land, the river, and the gods. Religion played a central role in farming life. The flooding of the Nile was attributed to divine forces, and farmers offered prayers and small sacrifices to gods like Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation, and Osiris, who symbolized fertility and the cycles of life and death. Fields themselves could feel sacred, for each harvest was proof of the god's favor. When harvests were good, gratitude was shown with offerings. When they failed, prayers and rituals sought forgiveness or help. Thus, faith gave meaning to the uncertainties of farming, turning the hardships of drought or pestilence into events woven into a divine order rather than random misfortunes. The role of women in farming communities was equally essential. Though men were often seen in the fields guiding animals and plows, women played a vital part in sustaining households. They ground grain into flour, baked bread, brewed beer, wove flax into linen, and cared for children. Their labor was continuous, and though less visible than the work in the fields, it was no less demanding. The sound of grinding stones was a constant background to village life, as women knelt over heavy stones to crush grain, hour after hour, day after day. Bread was the essence of life, and without this unending effort, the crops harvested by men would never reach the table. Taxes and obligations tied farming families closely to the state. Officials came to measure fields and assess expected yields, and from these assessments, a share was demanded as tax. Farmers had little power to resist, and their lives were often marked by the pressure of these demands. Granaries filled with collected grain became symbols of wealth and security for temples and rulers, but for the farmer, they often represented loss, a reminder that their labor supported not only their families, but the entire machinery of state and religion. Yet despite the burdens, the system endured for centuries, in part because it provided stability, and stability was valued above all else. Farmers accepted their place, not because it was easy, but because it was known, inherited, and unchanging. The passage of time was marked not by novelty, but by the return of the flood, the growth of crops, and the cycle of harvest. To live as a farmer was to live within this endless rhythm, to endure and to trust that the Nile would rise again, as it always had, and as it always would. As the centuries passed, the role of the farmer in Egypt remained much the same, because the land itself demanded it, and the river allowed for no other way. The constancy of farming life created a society that prized stability over change, where innovations came slowly and traditions were preserved carefully. For the farmer, change was not a goal, but a threat. For any disruption to the delicate balance of the Nile and its cycles could mean hardship, hunger, or collapse. To look at their lives is to see a portrait of repetition, where each generation inherited not only land, but the knowledge of when to plant, how to irrigate, and how to gather the harvest at just the right moment. The work was heavy and the tools were simple, yet the knowledge behind the timing and the patience required was profound. Families lived in villages that mirrored one another across the Nile Valley. Mud brick houses lined narrow paths, animals were tethered close to homes, and small gardens sometimes grew vegetables or herbs that could supplement the diet of grain and beer. Within these villages, the rhythm of daily life never strayed far from the demands of the fields. Men went out to guide plows and direct water into canals. Women spun flax or ground grain. Children carried water or watched over goats and cattle. Every person had a role to play, and the survival of the household depended on all members doing their share. These villages were often small, yet together they formed the backbone of a kingdom that stretched for hundreds of miles along the river. The Nile was the uniting thread, binding communities together into one civilization. Every year, the floods reminded the farmers of their dependence on forces greater than themselves. When the waters rose high and left behind deep layers of black soil, farmers rejoiced, for the harvest would be plentiful. When the waters failed to rise enough, fear spread quickly, for hunger was never far from memory. In times of scarcity, granaries became lifelines. Though farmers themselves might still go hungry, as much of their grain was claimed for taxes or stored for redistribution. The dependence on the Nile made Egyptian farming unique, but it also tied it closely to religion. Farmers saw the river as a divine gift, and so festivals were celebrated in honor of the gods who controlled its flow. Offerings of bread, beer, and grain were made at temples. Prayers were whispered as seeds were sown, and gratitude was expressed at each successful harvest. To farm was not only labor, but also worship, an act of participating in the divine cycle of life, death, and renewal. The farmer's world was humble, yet it sustained the grandeur of Egypt. The pyramids of Giza, the temples of Luxor, the statues of kings, all of these required the surplus produced in silent fields by countless unnamed laborers. Grain was shipped along the Nile in boats, stored in granaries, and counted by scribes. The wealth of Egypt flowed not from gold or conquest alone, but from the endless labor of those who bent over the soil, season after season, ensuring that there was always bread to eat and beer to drink. Their contribution was silent but absolute. Education for farmers' children was not written in scrolls, but carried in actions repeated daily. A boy might learn to handle a plow by following behind his father, first carrying tools, then guiding animals, then finally planting seeds on his own. A girl might learn to grind grain by watching her mother's hands, then imitating the steady rhythm until her muscles remembered the motion without thought. These lessons were not written down, yet they were passed along faithfully, ensuring that farming knowledge endured across centuries without fading. The social position of farmers remained low, yet their importance was unquestionable. Scribes sometimes wrote about the harshness of farming life, contrasting it with the easier work of writing or record-keeping. They described the farmer as burdened, sweating, punished by insects, bent under the sun, and struggling to meet the demands of tax collectors. While these descriptions emphasized the hardships, they also revealed a truth: that farming was essential, that without it, nothing else in society could exist. The state depended on the grain, the temples depended on offerings, the people depended on bread. The farmer's life was heavy, but it was the foundation of all others. At night, when the day's work ended, the villages settled into a quiet calm. Oil lamps flickered, families gathered around small meals, and the sounds of the river in the distance offered a reminder that tomorrow the cycle would begin again. There was little room for dreams of a different life, for the farmer's path was set by birth and tradition. Yet within the quiet of their villages, there was also a sense of continuity, of belonging to a chain of ancestors who had farmed before them and descendants who would farm after them. Their lives were not celebrated with monuments or remembered in great stories, but their work was the invisible force that allowed Egypt to endure for thousands of years. And so, part by part, day by day, and season by season, the story of Egypt's farmers unfolded slowly, like the river itself, steady, patient, and unending. When we look at the life of the Egyptian farmer across generations, what becomes clear is not the presence of dramatic events or sudden change, but rather the persistence of a pattern that endured for thousands of years. Farming in Egypt was more than a livelihood. It was the rhythm upon which the entire civilization was built. Each season repeated itself with such consistency that time was measured not in years, but in floods, plantings, and harvests. This stability made Egypt strong, but it also made the farmer's life predictable, a cycle of labor that bound him and his family to the soil. During the season of inundation, when the Nile spread across the land, the farmer could not work his fields, but this did not mean idleness. Instead, he often labored on state projects, digging canals, maintaining dikes, or contributing his strength to the construction of temples and monuments. In these times, the pharaoh's authority was visible, for it was the state that organized and commanded such projects, and the farmer, though humble, became part of something larger than his village. When the waters retreated and the fields were revealed, the season of planting began, and life narrowed once again to the essential tasks of survival. Seeds were scattered into the damp earth, guided by hands that knew the soil's texture, its readiness, and its needs. The plow carved lines in the black silt, animals pulled slowly, and children ran alongside with laughter mixed with duty. The work was simple, yet it demanded attention, for each step had consequences. Too much seed wasted the harvest, too little left fields barren. Timing was everything, and the farmer's wisdom was not written in books, but in his intimate knowledge of the land. The season of growth brought with it the constant need for irrigation. The Nile's floods could not reach every corner, so canals were maintained, and water was lifted tirelessly using the shaduf. This simple device, a balance of wood and rope, became an extension of the farmer's body. Day after day, he repeated the motion of pulling, lifting, pouring, a rhythm as steady as his own breath. It was tedious and exhausting, but without it, the crops would wither and hunger would follow. The season of harvest brought relief, but also urgency, for crops had to be gathered quickly before they spoiled. Sickles cut through stalks of grain, bundles were tied, and the air filled with the dust of chaff and the smell of ripening wheat. Animals trampled the stalks to separate the grain, and families worked side by side, turning the labor into a communal act of survival. Grain was measured, stored, and a share always claimed by officials for taxes. The weight of obligation pressed heavily, for even a bountiful harvest did not guarantee plenty for the farmer's own household. Yet in completing this cycle, the farmer fulfilled his role in society, supporting not only his family, but the temples, the soldiers, the scribes, and the king himself. Within their homes, families lived simply. Mud brick walls sheltered them from the desert sun, and reed mats provided places to rest. Meals were made of bread and beer, flavored with onions, lentils, or fish when available. Women spun flax into thread, weaving linen that clothed the family, while children learned through imitation, copying the motions of their parents until they became second nature. Life was not filled with luxury, but it was filled with continuity. And in this continuity, there was a kind of security. Religion was ever present, not only in temples, but in the fields. Farmers prayed to Hapi, the god of the Nile, for steady floods, and to Osiris for fertile soil and abundant crops. They offered small sacrifices, not of gold or jewels, but of grain, bread, or beer, the very products of their labor. Their faith was woven into their work, making each act of sowing and harvesting an offering in itself. Hardship was inevitable. There were years when the Nile did not rise as expected, and famine stalked the land. There were times when locusts descended in clouds, stripping fields bare in hours. There were times when taxation left little for families to eat. Yet through these trials, farmers endured, for endurance was their only option. They did not rebel against their place in society, for tradition and necessity held them firmly in their roles. Instead, they carried on, season after season, generation after generation, their work quiet but indispensable. And so, in the long story of Egypt, it is not only the pharaohs or the temples that stand as symbols of endurance, but also the countless farmers whose names are lost, yet whose labor gave life to the nation. Their days may have seemed monotonous, but within that monotony was the power to sustain one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. The deeper one looks into the life of Egyptian farmers, the more one sees how their steady existence was tied not only to the soil, but also to the structure of society, to the expectations of rulers, and to the unseen weight of history pressing upon their shoulders. For them, time moved not in revolutions but in cycles, repeating patterns that gave a sense of order even in the face of hardship. Their villages stood close to the river, for without the Nile, there could be no life. Each year when the waters rose, the villagers watched with quiet anticipation, measuring the level of the flood by marks on stone or banks of earth, knowing that too much or too little could shape their fate for months to come. In times when the river rose just right, they felt relief, for the fields would be covered in rich black silt that promised abundance. In times when the waters failed, worry spread like a shadow, for without the gift of the Nile, there could be no bread, and without bread, there could be no survival. The farmer's day was built upon routine. He rose at dawn, when the air was cool and the horizon glowed with the first light of the sun. His tools were simple: a wooden plow, a hoe, a sickle. His animals were few: oxen for pulling, goats for milk, perhaps a donkey for carrying loads. His clothing was made of linen, spun by his wife or daughter. His food came from his own harvest, and his shelter was shaped from mud brick built with his own hands. His life was humble, but it was complete, sustained by the land and the family who shared the burden. Women worked constantly, grinding grain on heavy stones until their hands and backs ached, brewing beer in clay jars, baking bread in small clay ovens, weaving linen from flax, and raising children who themselves would grow into the same cycle of duties. Children were never far from work. Even in their play, they imitated adults, building miniature plows or chasing goats through the village, as if preparing themselves for the roles they would inevitably assume. Education was not the reading of hieroglyphs or the memorization of laws, but the slow and steady apprenticeship of daily life, where observation and repetition became the textbooks of survival. The farmer's world was measured in effort. He irrigated his fields by lifting water with the shadoof, repeating the motion over and over until it became as automatic as breathing. He tended animals, repaired tools, patched roofs, and gathered firewood. His days were long, yet he found rest in the predictability of the tasks. For the tasks were familiar, and in familiarity there was comfort. The diet of his household was plain but sustaining. Bread formed the center of every meal, made from emmer wheat ground into flour and baked into loaves that were dense and filling. Beer was consumed daily, less as a luxury than as a necessity, for it provided hydration and nourishment in a climate where water alone was not always safe to drink. Onions, garlic, lentils, and occasionally fish added variety, while fruits such as dates or figs were treats when they were available. Meat was rare, saved for festivals or sacrifices, a reminder that life was not about indulgence, but about endurance. Religion framed the farmer's existence. He did not see his labor as separate from the gods, for the Nile itself was divine, a gift from Hapi, and the soil was tied to Osiris, who represented fertility and rebirth. Small offerings were made to ensure good floods and healthy crops, a loaf of bread placed at a shrine, a jar of beer poured in thanks, a prayer whispered as seeds were sown. For the farmer, farming was not only physical work, but also a spiritual act, a participation in the eternal cycles of life and death that defined the world. The social structure of Egypt placed farmers low in rank, yet their importance was beyond question. Scribes recorded their taxes, priests blessed their harvests, officials measured their fields, and rulers depended on their surplus to feed armies and workers. Though their names were not carved in stone, though they were rarely praised in poems or monuments, their role was indispensable. The grain they produced was wealth itself, filling granaries, feeding cities, and becoming the foundation upon which the glory of Egypt rested. Taxes were heavy, and officials often took more than was fair. Farmers bore this burden quietly, for resistance was rare and dangerous. Yet even under the weight of taxation, they continued, for their survival and the survival of their families depended on fulfilling these obligations. The state demanded, and the farmer supplied, and so the cycle of power was maintained. At night, after long hours under the sun, the villages settled into silence. Oil lamps flickered inside mud brick walls, children drifted to sleep on mats, and the distant sound of the river filled the darkness. The farmer lay down knowing that tomorrow would bring the same tasks, the same challenges, the same repetition. Yet within this repetition lay security, for as long as the Nile rose, life could continue. His was not a life of glory or luxury, but of endurance, and in that endurance he became part of something far greater than himself. A civilization that endured for millennia because its farmers never ceased to till the soil, to sow the seed, to gather the harvest, and to trust in the eternal river. The farmer of ancient Egypt lived in a world where the boundaries of life were narrow, yet within those boundaries there was a fullness born from repetition, necessity, and tradition. His days were shaped by the sun, his years by the Nile, and his generations by the soil that never ceased to demand labor. To live as a farmer was to live in rhythm with forces both natural and divine, to endure not only the weight of physical toil, but also the responsibilities of sustaining family, village, and kingdom. The Nile gave and the Nile withheld, and the farmer accepted both with quiet patience. When the waters rose just right, flooding the fields and leaving behind layers of dark silt, the farmer felt secure, for the land would yield enough to feed his family and satisfy the demands of the state. When the waters failed, he felt the creeping dread of scarcity, for without fertile soil there could be no bread, and without bread, nothing else could endure. Yet even in lean years, he returned to the fields, repeating the same motions, trusting in cycles that had lasted for centuries and would last for centuries more. The tools of his life were unchanged over generations. The wooden plow, drawn by oxen, cut furrows into the soil. The hoe turned earth and pulled weeds. The sickle, with its flint or copper blades, harvested grain. The grinding stones turned kernels into flour with steady, rhythmic pressure, while jars of clay stored grain, beer, and oil. These tools were simple, yet they were sufficient, and their very simplicity made them timeless. The sounds of farming life were not dramatic but constant. The creak of wood, the splash of water lifted by the shaduf, the lowing of oxen, the soft chants of workers keeping pace with their labor. These were not sounds of change, but of continuity, repeating endlessly, as if the land itself sang the same song through countless generations. Within the household, life carried its own cycle. Women spun flax into linen, their hands moving with practiced ease, weaving thread into cloth that clothed their families. Children played in the dust of the village, imitating their parents, lifting small sticks as plows, scattering handfuls of seeds, or pretending to grind grain on miniature stones. In this way, the knowledge of survival was passed on naturally, not through formal schooling, but through daily immersion in the tasks of life. A boy did not need to be told that he would one day guide the plow. He knew it simply by watching his father. A girl did not need to be told that she would grind grain or weave linen. She learned by following her mother. Each generation stepped into the roles left by the last, creating an unbroken chain of labor and endurance. Religion was the framework that gave meaning to this endless work. Farmers prayed to Hapi for the floods, to Osiris for fertility, to Renenutet for protection of the harvest. Shrines and temples stood as reminders that their labor was not only physical, but also spiritual. Each seed sown was an act of faith, each harvest a sign of divine favor. In offering a portion of their crops to the gods, the farmers affirmed their place in a larger order, where human effort and divine will were bound together. Taxes were an unavoidable reality, a constant reminder that the farmer's work belonged not only to himself, but also to the state. Officials arrived with measuring rods and scribes recorded the yields, ensuring that a portion was taken to fill granaries. These stores supported armies, temples, and great building projects. Farmers carried this burden with resignation, for resistance was rare and dangerous, and survival meant compliance. Yet despite this, the farmer endured, for he had little choice. The rhythm of life continued, sustained by necessity. At festivals, when the harvest was complete, there was some relief, some joy in shared food, drink, and song. These moments of celebration broke the monotony, but they were fleeting, soon giving way to the next cycle of labor. At night, after the fields were quiet and the river shimmered under the moon, the farmer lay in his simple home, listening to the soft voices of family and the distant sounds of animals. His body ached from toil, but his mind found rest in the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same. There was comfort in the sameness, in the certainty that the river would rise, that the fields would be sown, that the harvest would come. And so his life flowed on, steady and unchanging, part of the eternal rhythm of Egypt itself. His was not a story of glory, but without him, there could be no glory for Egypt. His name was not carved in stone, yet his labor was written into every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every block raised in the great temples and pyramids. In silence and in toil, the farmer became the unseen foundation of one of the world's greatest civilizations, his life a quiet testament to endurance, patience, and the eternal cycle of the Nile. The Egyptian farmer did not seek fame or wealth, for such things were far from his reach, but what he did seek, and what he valued most, was stability. His life was grounded in the certainty of repetition, in the comfort of knowing that his tasks today would be the same as his tasks tomorrow, and that his children would one day carry out those same duties after him. To rise with the sun, to step into the fields, to feel the soil beneath his hands, to bend his body to the plow. These were not moments of change, but of continuity. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell, where kings ruled and died, the farmer's life endured as a constant, unaffected by the shifting tides of politics or conquest. The Nile remained his master, and its cycles remained his guide. When the river swelled, his fields were submerged, and he waited. When the waters receded, he planted. When the crops grew, he irrigated. When the stalks ripened, he harvested. And when the harvest was stored, he offered his share in taxes and sacrifices, keeping only enough for survival. Each step of this cycle was predictable, yet it demanded vigilance, for the balance between abundance and scarcity was fragile. He knew that one poor flood could mean hunger, that one swarm of locusts could erase months of labor, that one heavy demand from the tax collector could reduce his household to hardship. Yet he carried on, as his ancestors had, for there was no other path. His home was built of mud brick, the same material that shaped villages across the Nile Valley. These houses were modest, with flat roofs where family members might sleep on hot nights, with small windows to let in air, with walls coated in plaster to keep out the heat. Inside, jars stored grain, baskets held onions or garlic, clay ovens baked bread, and mats provided rest. Furniture was minimal, but everything had purpose. Children slept together in corners, while parents occupied the central space. Animals often lived close by, their sounds mixing with the murmurs of human voices, creating the chorus of rural life. Women spent much of their days in work that was less visible but equally vital. They ground grain with heavy stones, brewed beer in clay jars, baked bread for each meal, and wove flax into linen. Their labor never ended, for the needs of the household were constant. A daughter would learn these tasks early, kneeling beside her mother, imitating the steady rhythm of grinding grain or weaving thread. Sons followed their fathers into the fields, learning to guide oxen or scatter seeds. In this way, knowledge passed silently from one generation to the next, not through words but through repetition, each child stepping into roles already defined by centuries of tradition. Religion provided comfort in this endless work. Farmers believed that their labor was part of a divine order, that the gods themselves had shaped the Nile and the soil for their use. Offerings were made to Hapi for the river's floods, to Osiris for the fertility of crops, to Renenutet for protection of the harvest. Temples received grain as gifts, and priests performed rituals to ensure abundance. The farmer's small sacrifices, whether a loaf of bread or a handful of grain, were acts of faith that connected his daily toil to the larger world of gods and eternity. Taxes, however, reminded him of his place in society. Scribes came to record his yields, officials took a portion for the state, and the weight of obligation pressed upon him as much as the sun upon his back. Though he might resent the burden, he had little choice but to comply, for resistance was met with punishment. Yet even this was accepted as part of the cycle, another form of inevitability that framed his life. The wealth of Egypt was built upon his harvest, yet he himself lived with little. His meals were plain, his clothes simple, his tools old. Yet without his grain, there would be no bread for workers, no beer for celebrations, no surplus for trade. Without his silent labor, temples would not receive offerings, armies would not be fed, and great monuments would not rise. He did not see himself as important, but his role was essential, a foundation upon which the entire kingdom rested. At the end of each day, as the sun set behind the desert hills and painted the river in shades of red and gold, the farmer returned home weary but steady. He ate his bread, drank his beer, and sat with his family in quiet conversation. The stars emerged above, brilliant and endless, and he perhaps looked upward with a sense of smallness, but also with a sense of continuity. Tomorrow he would wake, as he had today, to repeat the same motions, to carry the same burdens, to trust again in the Nile. And so his life, though simple, became timeless, a thread woven through centuries, binding together the past, the present, and the future of Egypt itself. As the story of the Egyptian farmer comes to a close, what stands out is not a tale of conquest or drama, but the quiet truth that civilization itself rested on his shoulders. He did not leave behind palaces or monuments, but the results of his labor endured in every loaf of bread that fed a worker, in every jar of beer that sustained a laborer, in every granary filled with grain that kept famine away. His life was one of repetition, yet within that repetition lay the strength of Egypt, a strength that allowed the kingdom to endure for thousands of years. The farmer's year was always divided into the same 3 seasons: the inundation of Akhet, the growing season of Peret, and the harvest of Shamu. Each season held its own duties, each repeated endlessly, each passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. These cycles created a rhythm of life that was almost unchanging, a rhythm as steady as the river itself. The farmer accepted this rhythm, for it gave order to his days and meaning to his years. In the season of inundation, he repaired tools, tended animals, and waited for the waters to retreat. In the season of planting, he bent his back to scatter seed and lift water with the sharuf. In the season of harvest, he cut the stalks with his sickle, bundled the grain, threshed it with care, and stored what remained after taxes had been paid. Then the cycle began again, as it always had, as it always would. His home was simple, built of mud brick, yet filled with a warmth of family. His food was plain, bread and beer, onions and fish, yet it sustained him. His clothing was woven of flax, spun by the hands of his wife or daughter, plain linen garments that were light in the heat of the sun. His life was not marked by abundance, but it was marked by continuity, and in continuity there was a kind of security. He knew that tomorrow would be like today, that the Nile would rise and fall, that the fields would demand their labor, that the gods would expect their offerings, and that his family would continue to live as long as he worked the land. Religion framed his work with meaning. He prayed to Hapi for the river, to Osiris for fertility, to Renenutet for protection of the harvest. Each offering of bread or grain tied his daily struggle to a larger order, assuring him that his labor was not wasted, but part of the divine balance of the world. His prayers were simple, his offerings humble, but they carried the weight of faith, a faith that sustained him in hardship as much as in abundance. The state demanded its share, and the farmer gave it, for he had no choice. Scribes came to record, officials came to measure, and a portion of his harvest went to the granaries. He accepted this as part of his duty, a burden heavy but familiar. His own family survived on what remained, and in that survival there was enough. He did not dream of riches, for such things were not for him, but he dreamed of steady floods, healthy crops, and children who would live to carry on the same work. The farmer's legacy is not one of names or stories, for his life was rarely recorded, but his presence can be felt in the very survival of Egypt. Without him, the temples would not have risen, the armies would not have marched, the scribes would not have written, and the pharaohs would not have ruled. His was the unseen hand that fed them all, the quiet foundation upon which greatness stood. And though his name was lost to time, his labor was eternal, carried in the bread of every meal, in the beer of every gathering, in the stability of a nation that endured for centuries. At night, the farmer lay down in his simple home, his body weary from the day, his mind at ease with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same tasks. He did not fear the sameness, for sameness meant survival. The stars shone above the desert, the river whispered in the distance, and the silence of the fields promised that life would continue. And so the farmer slept, just as his ancestors had, just as his children would, part of a cycle that never truly ended. In the end, the story of Egyptian farmers and their crops is not one of excitement, but of endurance. It is the story of men and women who worked quietly, without glory, yet sustained one of the greatest civilizations in history. Their lives were humble, their tasks repetitive, their burdens heavy, but in their patience and persistence, they gave Egypt its foundation. Their story is one of quiet strength, of labor without end, of trust in the river, and of faith in the eternal cycle of life and death. And though they are gone, their rhythm remains, echoing in the fields, in the waters, and in the very idea of civilization itself. And so, our story has come to an end. Before we move on to the next tale, I kindly ask you for 1 like and 1 subscribe, so you can always join us again on these quiet nights. Now, let us continue our series of boring history for sleep, with the story of the quiet lives of medieval peasants. In the long centuries that stretched across the Middle Ages, when castles rose over the hills and kings ruled from stone halls, the vast majority of people did not live as knights or nobles, but as peasants. Their lives unfolded not in the echo of battle or the grandeur of courts, but in the quiet rhythm of fields, villages, and seasons that repeated year after year. To be a medieval peasant was to live within narrow boundaries, yet within those boundaries lay a complete world, shaped by the soil, the church, and the duties owed to the land and to the lords who owned it. The peasant was tied to the earth, and in the earth he found both his burden and his survival. Most peasants lived in small villages scattered across the countryside, clusters of wooden huts thatched with straw, surrounded by strips of farmland. These homes were simple, built with timber frames and walls of wattle and daub, their floors often of packed earth, their interiors dark and smoky from open hearths. Furniture was sparse, perhaps a bench, a wooden chest, or a rough bed stuffed with straw. Yet within these modest homes, families ate, slept, and gathered, their daily lives centered on survival more than comfort. Meals were plain, dominated by bread made from rye or barley, pottage cooked from peas, beans, and root vegetables, and ale brewed in small quantities. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions or festivals, for animals were too valuable alive to be eaten regularly. Eggs, cheese, and milk added some variety, while herbs from gardens flavored otherwise repetitive dishes. Hunger was never far away, for harvests could fail, and stores could run low before the next crop was ready. To the peasant, food was not a choice, but a matter of endurance, another reminder that survival depended on the mercy of nature and the toil of labor. Work defined every season. In spring, the ground was plowed and sown with seeds, often using simple wooden plows drawn by oxen. In summer, fields were tended, weeds pulled, and livestock grazed. Autumn brought the harvest, a time of long days spent cutting, gathering, and threshing grain, the community working together to secure enough food for the winter. Winter was quieter, but not idle, for repairs were made to tools and homes, and livestock needed care. Each season demanded its own tasks, Each year repeated the same cycle, and each generation inherited the same rhythm. Life was not measured in novelty, but in the steady repetition of duties that left little room for change. The peasant owed not only labor to his own household, but also obligations to the lord of the manor. Rents were paid not in coin, which was scarce, but in a portion of crops, in labor on the lord's lands, and in services required by custom. A certain number of days might be spent plowing the lord's fields, harvesting his grain, repairing his fences, or transporting his goods. These duties were heavy, yet they were accepted as part of life, for the land belonged to the lord, and the peasant lived upon it by his permission. The manorial system tied peasants and lords together, a web of obligation that gave order but also limited freedom. Religion provided meaning and comfort within this narrow life. The village church stood at the center of community, both physically and spiritually. Peasants attended mass, marked holy days, and participated in festivals that brought moments of relief from daily labor. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals bound the community together under the watch of the church, and the teachings of priests reminded the peasants that their hardships were part of a divine plan. The promise of heaven gave hope in lives filled with toil, while the threat of sin and damnation encouraged obedience and patience. Faith was woven into every moment, from prayers before meals to blessings for the fields, and in this faith peasants found a way to endure the difficulties of their existence. Clothing was simple, often made of wool spun and woven by hand. Men wore tunics belted at the waist, with leggings or hose, while women wore long dresses and aprons. Colors were muted, dyes being expensive, so most garments were in shades of brown, gray, or dull green. Footwear was basic, sometimes only wooden clogs or leather shoes when available. These clothes were not made for beauty, but for function, warm enough to withstand cold winters, light enough for summer fields. They were patched and repaired until they could no longer be worn, and then remade into something smaller, for nothing was wasted. Though their status was low and their labor heavy, peasants found strength in community. Villages worked together during harvests, shared tools and animals, and supported one another in times of hardship. Feasts at festivals, weddings, or the completion of a successful harvest provided rare moments of joy, when music, dancing, and laughter filled the village green. These moments did not erase the burdens of life, but they offered glimpses of relief, enough to sustain the spirit through another cycle of toil. And so the lives of medieval peasants unfolded quietly, without grandeur, without wealth, but with persistence. They worked, they prayed, they endured. Their names were not written in chronicles, their deeds were not carved in stone, but their labor fed the lords, built the wealth of kingdoms, and sustained the very structure of medieval society. Their story is not of glory, but of quiet endurance, of the steady strength that lies in repetition, of the patient labor that, though overlooked, carried the weight of history upon humble shoulders. To understand the daily existence of medieval peasants, one must imagine a world in which nearly every hour of life was dictated by the demands of the land and the passing of the seasons. There was no electricity, no machinery, and little in the way of luxury. Instead, there was the rising of the sun, the ringing of church bells, the sound of animals in the byre, and the endless labor of fields and hearth. A peasant family began its day at dawn, with the first light spilling over the village fields. Men went to tend the land, to plow, sow, or weed, while women remained closer to home, spinning wool, grinding grain, baking bread, and raising children. Children themselves were seldom idle. Even the youngest carried water, collected firewood, or helped in small ways. The cycle of work was constant, yet it was familiar, and in its familiarity lay a form of stability that bound each generation to the one before. The houses in which peasants lived were built for necessity rather than beauty. Timber frames were filled with wattle and daub, roofs thatched with straw, floors of hard earth worn smooth by countless footsteps. A central hearth provided warmth and light, though it also filled the room with smoke, for chimneys were rare. Livestock might be kept inside during the winter, their body heat offering some small comfort against the cold. Furnishings were sparse: a bench, a stool, perhaps a wooden chest for storing clothing or tools. Sleeping arrangements were communal, with straw-stuffed mattresses shared by parents and children alike. Privacy was unknown, but so too were solitude and isolation. for life was always lived together. Food formed another rhythm of life. Bread made from coarse rye or barley was the staple, eaten daily in thick slices. Pottage, a stew of grains, beans, peas, and root vegetables, simmered slowly over the hearth, eaten with whatever ingredients were available. On rare occasions, meat such as pork or mutton was added, though animals were often too valuable alive to be slaughtered except for feasts. Milk from cows or goats was consumed fresh or turned into cheese, while ale brewed in the village provided safe hydration in place of water that was often unsafe. Seasonal fruits, nuts, and herbs supplemented the diet, but hunger was common, particularly in years of poor harvests. For the peasant, food was never taken for granted, but seen as the direct result of the land's generosity and their own unending labor. The social structure of the village was bound tightly to the manorial system. Peasants were often serfs, bound to the land and unable to leave without the lord's permission. They owed labor service, sometimes called corvée, which required them to work on the lord's fields for a set number of days each week. In addition to this, they paid rents in the form of crops or small livestock, and they performed other tasks when required, such as repairing roads or building fences. These obligations weighed heavily, but they were accepted as part of the natural order. In return, the Lord offered protection, and the manor provided a structure within which peasants could live and survive. The church also stood at the center of peasant life, not only as a spiritual guide, but as a social and cultural hub. The ringing of bells marked the hours of the day, calling the faithful to prayer or signaling the start of work. Holy days and festivals punctuated the monotonous cycle of labor, bringing moments of joy and community gathering. Easter, Christmas, harvest festivals, and saints' days provided rare opportunities for feasting, dancing, and rest. Priests reminded peasants that their place in life was divinely ordained, that hardship on earth was balanced by the promise of salvation in heaven. In this teaching, peasants found comfort, accepting the difficulties of their existence as part of God's will. Clothing for peasants was practical, made largely from wool. Women spun and wove wool into cloth, which was cut into simple tunics, dresses, and cloaks. Men wore tunics belted at the waist, with hose or leggings, while women wore long gowns with aprons. Colors were subdued, browns and grays from undyed wool, though vegetable dyes sometimes added muted greens or yellows. Clothes were patched repeatedly until they could no longer be used, then repurposed into smaller garments or rags. Shoes were often simple leather pieces or wooden clogs, though many went barefoot in warmer months. Clothing was not about fashion but about necessity, about warmth and endurance through seasons of cold and rain. Though their lives were filled with labor and burden, peasants found strength in their community. Villages worked together at harvest time, families shared tools, neighbors helped one another with repairs, and the survival of one often depended on the cooperation of all. Feasts and festivals, though rare, brought laughter, music, and dancing, reminding everyone that joy could still be found even in the midst of hardship. It was this balance of labor and occasional celebration that kept the spirit of the peasantry alive. And so the quiet lives of medieval peasants unfolded, season after season, year after year. They rose with the sun, worked the soil, prayed in the church, and rested in homes that were humble but filled with family. Their world was small, but within it they carried the weight of kingdoms. For without their labor, the castles, the armies, and the wealth of the lords could not have existed. Their story is not of glory, but of endurance, a steady rhythm of survival that shaped the Middle Ages from the ground up. The life of the medieval peasant was bound by the seasons, and each season brought with it tasks that were as predictable as they were demanding. In the spring, fields had to be prepared for sowing. Men guided heavy wooden plows, often pulled by oxen, while women and children followed behind, scattering seeds into the freshly turned soil. The work was slow and exhausting, for the plows were heavy and the soil often stubborn, but it had to be done before the rains passed and the earth hardened. Seed had to be rationed carefully, for waste could mean hunger later in the year. As the seeds sprouted, weeds had to be pulled by hand, and scarecrows or watchful children kept birds from eating the fragile shoots. Summer was a time of constant labor in the fields. Crops had to be weeded, ditches cleared for irrigation, and animals tended carefully. The peasants rose at dawn, worked long hours beneath the sun, and returned home only when the light faded. The days were long, but there was little choice. for the success of the harvest depended on constant attention. At the same time, livestock such as pigs, cows, and goats required care. Pigs roamed in the woods, feeding on acorns, while cows provided milk and goats offered both milk and meat when necessary. Sheep were kept for their wool, which was spun and woven into garments that clothed entire families. Each animal had its role, and the peasant family relied on them as much as on the fields. Autumn brought the harvest, perhaps the busiest and most important season of all. Whole villages worked together to gather crops before the weather turned cold and wet. Men cut the stalks of grain with sickles, women tied them into bundles, and children carried them to be threshed. Threshing, the process of separating grain from stalks, was done by beating the bundles with flails or by driving animals over them. The grain was then winnowed, tossed into the air so that the wind carried away the lighter chaff, while the heavier kernels fell to the ground. Every hand was needed, and every hour counted, for a delayed harvest could mean the loss of an entire year's work. Once the harvest was complete, rents and tithes had to be paid. A portion of the grain went to the Lord as rent, while another share went to the church as a tithe. What remained was stored carefully, often in pits lined with straw or in wooden barns, though spoilage and rodents could never be fully prevented. The memory of past famines was never far away, and peasants lived with the constant awareness that a single poor harvest could bring hardship to an entire village. Winter was quieter, but not without work. With fields resting, peasants turned to other tasks. Tools were repaired, new clothes were made, and firewood was gathered. Animals were kept close to the home, sometimes even inside, for their warmth was welcome during cold nights. Food during the winter was limited, and meals grew simpler as supplies dwindled. Dried beans, salted fish, and hard bread sustained families until the spring. Hunger was common in late winter, the so-called hungry months, when old stores ran low and new crops had not yet been planted. Survival during this time required both endurance and careful planning. The cycle of the seasons dominated every aspect of peasant life, and there was little room for leisure. Yet there were moments of rest. Festivals tied to the church calendar provided rare days away from work. On saints' days or during Christmas and Easter, peasants might gather for feasts, games, and music. Ale flowed freely, bread and meat were shared, and laughter filled the village. These occasions did not erase the burdens of life, but they offered relief, reminders that joy could still be found, even within hardship. The church played an ever-present role in shaping how peasants viewed their lives. Priests preached that labor was a duty given by God, that patience and obedience were virtues, and that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. The peasant's place in society was presented as part of a divine plan, and this teaching provided comfort and acceptance. Religion marked the milestones of life, birth, marriage, and death, and offered hope beyond the daily struggles. The social order was clear, and peasants rarely questioned it, for they had little power to change it. Clothing reflected the simplicity of their status. Wool was the most common material, spun and woven in the village. Colors were dull, browns and grays that blended with the earth, though brighter dyes were sometimes used for festivals. Clothes were worn until they could no longer be mended, then cut into smaller garments for children or used as rags. Shoes were scarce, and many peasants went barefoot during the warmer months, saving what footwear they had for winter or special occasions. Life was marked by repetition, but repetition was survival. The peasant family worked, ate, prayed, and slept in the same patterns day after day, season after season. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories rarely told, yet their labor sustained the entire structure of medieval society. Castles, cathedrals, and armies existed only because peasants tilled the soil and gathered the harvest. Their lives were humble, but their role was indispensable, a quiet endurance that carried history forward in silence. To look more closely at the life of medieval peasants is to see not only the rhythm of their daily labor, but also the structure of the society in which they lived. For the peasant was not an isolated figure, but part of a vast web of obligations, relationships, and traditions that gave shape to the Middle Ages. At the heart of the structure was the manorial system, a system that tied peasants to the land of a lord and bound them in duties that defined their existence. The manor was both a unit of agriculture and a unit of society. It consisted of the lord's house or castle, the surrounding farmland, the village where peasants lived, and the church that oversaw their spiritual lives. The peasants, Whether free tenants who rented their land or serfs who were legally bound to it, owed labor and produce to the Lord. In return, the Lord offered protection, justice, and the right to work the land. This arrangement may have seemed unequal, and indeed it was, but it was also accepted as the natural order of things, reinforced by custom, law, and religion. For the peasant, freedom was a concept with little meaning, for his world rarely extended beyond the village, the manor, and perhaps the nearby market town. Travel was limited, and most people lived and died within the same few miles where they were born. Yet within these narrow boundaries, a full life unfolded, with its own routines, responsibilities, and occasional joys. The obligations to the Lord were numerous. A peasant might owe several days each week working the domain, the portion of land kept directly for the Lord's benefit. He might also owe rents in grain, livestock, or labor services, such as repairing roads, fences, or mills. In addition, he was expected to use the Lord's mill to grind grain, the Lord's oven to bake bread, and the Lord's winepress to press grapes, paying fees each time. These small but constant obligations reminded the peasant that his life was tied to the authority of his Lord in countless ways. Yet despite these demands, peasants still retained portions of land to grow their own food, and it was upon this land that their survival depended. Their fields were often scattered strips in open fields, rather than one single plot. This system ensured that each peasant shared in both the good and poor soil, spreading risk more evenly across the village. The open field system also required cooperation, for no single peasant could work in isolation. Boundaries were shared, planting and harvesting were done together, and disputes were settled collectively. This sense of shared responsibility created a kind of unity, even as it also tied individuals more closely to communal routines. The daily life of peasants was not purely about toil. Though work filled most hours, there were also times of rest and gathering. In the evenings, families sat around the hearth, eating their meals of bread, pottage, and ale, telling stories, singing songs, or sharing news of the village. On holy days or festivals, the entire community gathered for feasts, dances, and games. Weddings were celebrated with days of merriment, filled with music and drinking, while funerals brought the community together in solemn remembrance. Though their lives were humble, peasants knew moments of joy, relief, and connection enough to balance the weight of daily labor. Religion provided the framework for much of this life. The church calendar structured the year with holy days, fasts, and feasts. Priests preached obedience, patience, and the promise of heaven for those who endured hardship faithfully. The village church was often the only stone building peasants knew, a symbol of permanence in a world of wood and thatch. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals tied each peasant's life to the church, while the ringing of bells marked not only religious services, but also the rhythms of the day itself. To be a peasant was to live in the shadow of the church, guided by its teachings and comforted by its promises. Clothing reflected their status, but also their resourcefulness. Wool was the primary material, spun and woven in homes, dyed when possible with natural plants, but often left undyed in shades of brown or gray. Garments were repaired again and again, handed down from parent to child, repurposed until they could no longer serve. Footwear was scarce, and many went without for much of the year, saving what shoes they had for harsh winters or special events. Comfort was secondary to survival, and appearance mattered less than function. Yet within their limits, peasants expressed individuality, perhaps through the choice of a dyed scarf, a carved wooden clasp, or a belt decorated with simple metalwork. The life expectancy of peasants was short by modern standards, often no more than 30 or 40 years, though many children did not survive past infancy. Disease, poor harvests, and accidents took lives quickly, and yet the population endured, for families were large, and the cycle of birth and death was constant. Life was fragile, but it was also resilient, for the peasants' endurance allowed the society to continue. And so, the quiet lives of medieval peasants were marked not by great achievements or dramatic events, but by steady persistence, by work and faith, by community and tradition. Their names were not remembered in chronicles, their deeds not carved in stone, yet their labor sustained the castles, the armies, the merchants, and the kings. Without them, the world of the Middle Ages would have had no foundation. The existence of medieval peasants was not one of grandeur or sudden change, but of constancy, repetition, and the careful endurance of hardship. To live as a peasant meant to be bound to the rhythms of nature, the obligations of the manor, and the teachings of the church. It was a life where little was expected to change from one year to the next, and where stability itself was the greatest comfort. A peasant's home was small, often 1 or 2 rooms at most, constructed from wood, wattle, and daub, roofed with thatch, and floored with packed earth. The central hearth provided heat, light, and a place to cook meals, though it also filled the room with smoke that clung to walls and lungs alike. Furniture was minimal, a wooden table if one was fortunate, benches for seating, chests for storage, and beds made of straw pallets. Privacy was unknown, as entire families shared the same space with animals kept indoors during cold months. Life was communal, not only within households but across entire villages. The layout of villages reflected this togetherness. Clusters of huts surrounded strips of open fields, while common areas served for grazing animals and gathering wood. Paths between houses were narrow and muddy, and the sounds of livestock, tools, and voices filled the air. The village church stood at the center, a symbol of both faith and authority, while the Lord's manor or castle loomed nearby as a reminder of obligation and power. Each day began at sunrise, with men heading to fields, women tending hearths and children, and everyone contributing in some way to survival. Meals were repetitive but sustaining. Bread formed the staple, coarse and dark, made from rye or barley. Pottage simmered constantly over the hearth, a stew of peas, beans, onions, or cabbage, with occasional additions of meat or fish if fortune allowed. Ale brewed from barley provided hydration safer than water. Milk, cheese, and eggs offered some variety, while seasonal fruits and nuts were gathered when available. The diet was monotonous, but it provided the energy needed to endure long hours of work. Hunger, however, was always near, especially in years of poor harvest when grain stores ran low before spring. Labor was ceaseless and divided by seasons. Spring meant plowing, sowing, and planting gardens. Summer meant weeding, repairing fences, and haymaking. Autumn was dominated by harvest, threshing, and storing grain. Winter was quieter, but filled with mending tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and tending animals. Each season had its duties, and each year repeated the same pattern, leaving little room for change or leisure. The obligations owed to the Lord weighed heavily on peasants. They worked his domain lands for free on certain days, repairing his property, maintaining his roads, or harvesting his crops. They paid rent not in coin, but in produce, chickens, or labor services, and they were bound to use his mill, his oven, and his wine press, paying fees each time. These small demands added up, leaving peasants with only a portion of their own harvests. Yet they endured, for the alternative was exile or punishment. The system was unequal, but it provided order, and peasants accepted it as part of life. Religion was the thread that tied meaning to their existence. The church calendar dictated both work and rest, with holy days offering rare pauses from toil. The priest's sermons reminded peasants that their hardships were part of God's will, and that patience and obedience would be rewarded in heaven. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals marked the passages of life, binding each family to the church as much as to the land. Prayers were said before planting and after harvest, blessings sought for healthy animals and safe childbirth, and confessions made to cleanse sins. Faith offered comfort when famine or disease struck, explaining suffering as part of a divine plan. Clothing was simple but functional. Wool was spun and woven into tunics for men and gowns for women, dyed with plants when possible, but often left undyed in shades of brown or gray. Cloaks offered warmth in winter, and leather belts held tools at the waist. Shoes were scarce, many going barefoot in warmer months. Clothes were patched and repurposed again and again, worn until they were rags. Though plain, clothing reflected the resourcefulness of peasants, who wasted nothing and used every fiber available to them. Community life balanced hardship with moments of relief. Villagers gathered for festivals, weddings, and feasts, when music, dancing, and ale created joy that broke the monotony of daily labor. Games were played on village greens, songs were sung by hearth fires, and stories were told that linked generations together. Though such moments were rare, they were cherished, providing strength to endure another cycle of work. Life was fragile, with disease, famine, and war threatening survival. Yet the resilience of peasants allowed society to endure. They raised children, repaired homes, sowed fields, and repeated the cycle endlessly. Their names were not remembered in chronicles, their deeds not carved into stone, yet without their labor, castles could not stand, armies could not march, and kings could not rule. They were the silent foundation of the Middle Ages, their lives modest, their labor repetitive, their endurance unyielding. And so the quiet lives of medieval peasants stretched across centuries, steady, constant, and essential. To live as a medieval peasant was to accept a life where repetition ruled every day and every year, for the cycle of work never truly ended, only changed shape with the seasons. Spring brought plowing and sowing, summer brought tending and watching, autumn brought harvesting and gathering, and winter brought mending and waiting. These tasks repeated so regularly that generations could pass with little difference between them, the only measure of time being the rise and fall of the sun, the ringing of church bells, and the festivals that broke the monotony. Each peasant family contributed to this endless labor, with roles divided but overlapping, for survival depended on cooperation. Men worked the open fields, guiding oxen to pull heavy wooden plows, digging ditches to carry water, and repairing fences and thatch. Women remained closer to the home, but worked no less, spinning wool, weaving cloth, grinding grain into flour, baking bread in clay ovens, tending gardens, milking animals, and raising children. Even the youngest were drawn into duty, scaring birds from fields, carrying water from wells, or gathering firewood from nearby woods. Work began at dawn and continued until dusk, leaving little room for leisure beyond moments of shared meals or brief gatherings at the village green. Houses of peasants reflected their humble lives. Constructed from timber, mud, and straw, they offered shelter but little comfort. Roofs of thatch leaked in heavy rain, floors of packed earth turned muddy in winter, and smoke from the central hearth blackened walls and lungs alike. Livestock often shared space with people during the cold months, their body heat helping to warm the single room. Beds were straw pallets covered with woolen blankets if a family was fortunate, but many slept side by side for warmth. Despite these hardships, homes were alive with the sounds of family, the crackling of fire, the clatter of tools, and the murmurs of evening conversation. Food remained plain and repetitive, yet it sustained life. The staple was bread made from barley, rye, or oats, dense and coarse compared to the bread of the wealthy. Alongside it, pottage simmered constantly, a stew of grains, peas, beans, and vegetables that changed little from day to day. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or the occasional slaughter of an animal, though eggs, cheese, and milk supplemented the diet. Ale brewed from barley was drunk daily, providing both nourishment and safety since water was often unsafe. Seasonal fruits like apples or berries were gathered when available, while nuts and herbs offered flavor. Meals were shared communally, eaten from wooden bowls with spoons carved by hand, reinforcing the sense of togetherness that defined peasant households. The obligations peasants owed to their lords were heavy but inescapable. In addition to working their own strips of land, they were required to spend several days each week on the domain, the lord's land, plowing, planting, or harvesting crops that did not belong to them. They also owed various fees: to use the lord's mill to grind grain, the lord's oven to bake bread, the lord's winepress to press grapes. These fees, called banalities, were reminders that the peasant's life was never fully his own, but always tied to the authority of the manor. Even marriages and inheritances sometimes required the lord's approval, further emphasizing the lack of independence that marked peasant life. Religion remained central, both as guidance and consolation. The village church was not only the spiritual heart of the community, but also the social hub. The priest preached sermons that emphasized obedience, humility, and patience, teaching that the hardships of this world would be rewarded in heaven. Holy days and feast days punctuated the year, offering rare chances for rest, music, dancing, and games. Christmas, Easter, and local saints' days transformed the village with processions, decorations, and shared meals. These moments provided relief from the monotony of toil and reminded peasants that joy, though fleeting, was still possible. Clothing was functional, made primarily from wool, spun by women and woven into cloth. Men wore tunics with belts and hose, women wore gowns with aprons, and children wore smaller versions of adult clothes. Cloaks and hoods offered protection from wind and rain, while wooden clogs or leather shoes were worn sparingly, Most clothing was in muted tones, for dyes were expensive, though some brighter colors appeared during festivals. Clothes were patched repeatedly, reused until they could no longer serve, then cut into rags or used for stuffing. Nothing was wasted, for every resource was precious. Community was the true strength of peasant life. Families depended on one another for survival, sharing tools, animals, and labor. At harvest, entire villages worked together, ensuring that crops were gathered before weather could ruin them. When homes needed repair, neighbors lent a hand. When famine or disease struck, the community provided what support it could. Though poor and burdened, peasants were bound together by necessity, and this unity gave them resilience. Life was short, fragile, and difficult, with disease and famine always near. Yet through persistence and cooperation, the peasant class sustained medieval society for centuries. Their names are largely forgotten, their deeds unrecorded, yet without them, the castles, the cathedrals, the courts, and the kingdoms of the Middle Ages could not have existed. Their lives were humble, their work unending, but in their endurance, they built the foundation upon which history rested. The life of medieval peasants was often described by those in higher stations as hard, brutish, and simple, but to the peasants themselves it was simply life, familiar and steady, shaped by repetition more than by surprise. Their world was one of fields and villages, of church bells and seasons, of obligations that seemed eternal and patterns that never changed. To be a peasant was to live within boundaries set not only by land and lord, but also by time itself. For the years were measured not in events, but in harvests, not in memories of battles or coronations, but in the slow cycles of growth and decay that governed crops and livestock. From the moment of birth, a peasant child's path was largely set. Infancy was dangerous, for disease and hunger often carried away the young, but those who survived grew quickly into small workers. By the age of 5 or 6, children already had tasks: carrying water from the well, gathering firewood from the forest, watching geese or chickens, or chasing birds from planted fields. Their education was not one of letters, but of labor, and they learned by watching their parents, imitating the motions of plowing, sowing, weaving, or grinding grain, until those motions became second nature. By the time a boy was a teenager, he could handle a plow or a sickle, and by the time a girl reached womanhood, she could manage a household, spinning wool, baking bread, and tending to children of her own. Families were large, for many hands were needed to share the endless work. Yet life expectancy was short, often no more than 30 or 40 years. Generations replaced one another swiftly, each carrying forward the same knowledge, the same rhythms, the same acceptance of place. Marriage bound families together within the village. Couples often married young, forming new households that were small extensions of the larger community. A wedding was one of the few moments of celebration in a peasant's life, marked by feasting, dancing, and the blessing of the church. Yet even marriage carried obligations, for peasants sometimes required the Lord's permission to wed, and fees might be paid as part of the arrangement. Children quickly followed, ensuring that the cycle of labor continued. Family life was not private in the modern sense, for homes were small and lives were lived in close quarters. But it was in this closeness that peasants found companionship and strength. The village itself was a world in miniature. Surrounding fields were divided into strips assigned to each household, while meadows, pastures, and forests were held in common. Villagers worked together to maintain fences, repair roads, and bring in harvests, and disputes were settled collectively, often in the presence of the Lord's steward or the priest. Cooperation was essential, for no household could truly survive on its own. Livestock wandered in shared fields, water was drawn from shared wells, and crops depended on the shared rhythm of planting and harvesting. Community was not optional, but necessary, and it bound peasants together as tightly as any law or custom. Religion gave their lives meaning beyond the daily grind. The village church stood as a constant presence, its bells marking time, its priest offering guidance, its services reminding peasants that their hardships were part of God's plan. Holy days were observed with care, and festivals brought moments of relief when the burdens of labor were set aside. At Easter, Christmas, and harvest time, the village came alive with feasting, music, and dancing. These moments of joy were rare but precious, offering memories that could sustain peasants through the long months of toil that followed. The teachings of the church also reinforced the social order, reminding peasants that obedience, humility, and patience were virtues, and that their suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife. Disease, famine, and war were constant threats. Plagues could sweep through villages with little warning, leaving fields untended and families broken. Poor harvests could mean hunger in winter, with peasants forced to stretch their stores of grain or survive on whatever could be gathered from forests and hedgerows. Armies passing through could seize food, livestock, and even people, leaving devastation in their wake. Yet despite these dangers, peasants endured, for they had no choice but to endure. Survival was an achievement, and endurance itself was a quiet form of strength. Clothing was modest and worn until it could no longer be patched. Wool was the most common fabric, spun into heavy tunics and cloaks that offered warmth in cold months. Women wore gowns belted at the waist, men wore tunics with hose, and children wore smaller versions of adult clothes. Shoes were rare, and many went barefoot in summer to preserve their footwear for winter. Garments were often the same from year to year, repaired and reused until they disintegrated. Yet in their resourcefulness, peasants demonstrated resilience, making the most of what they had. And so the quiet lives of medieval peasants passed, generation after generation, marked not by glory or change, but by repetition, obligation, and faith. Their names were seldom recorded, their stories seldom told, but their labor sustained the entire structure of medieval society. Without their endurance, the castles and cathedrals would have crumbled, the lords and kings would have starved, and the history of the Middle Ages would never have unfolded as it did. In silence, in humility, in the steady rhythm of toil, the peasants carried history upon their shoulders. The world of the medieval peasant was one defined not by sudden change, but by continuity, a life bound to the soil and the seasons, where every year unfolded with the same familiar tasks and the same familiar burdens. To wake as a peasant was to know that the day ahead would look much like the one before, that the work of the morning would mirror the work of yesterday, and that tomorrow would demand the same again. Yet within this repetition lay survival, for the land, though demanding, provided what was necessary when tended with patience. The fields stretched beyond the village in long open strips, divided among households, each family working its share, but always in rhythm with the rest. For the open field system required cooperation. Crops of rye, barley, oats, and wheat grew in rotation, ensuring that the soil did not exhaust itself, while meadows provided hay for animals and common land allowed for grazing. Livestock wandered in shared spaces, and decisions about planting and harvesting were made collectively, for no peasant truly stood apart from his neighbors. Community was the safeguard of survival, and the cooperation of many hands turned labor into endurance. Inside their homes, life was equally modest. The hearth was the center of the household, where food was cooked, warmth was found, and families gathered in the evenings. Smoke filled the air, escaping through thatch or small openings, coating beams black with soot. Furniture was few and simple: wooden stools, rough benches, a chest for storage, straw mattresses for sleeping. Light came from the fire or from small tallow candles, dim and flickering. Yet within this space, stories were told, songs were sung, and prayers were whispered, the intimacy of shared life binding families close together. Meals were plain but sustaining, with bread as the foundation of every diet, pottage simmering endlessly with beans, peas, onions, or cabbage, and ale brewed in small quantities to drink daily. On rare occasions, meat was added, often pork or mutton, sometimes preserved by salting or smoking. Dairy products from cows and goats offered cheese and milk, while eggs added protein when available. Herbs from gardens gave flavor, and fruit from hedgerows offered sweetness when in season. Hunger was never far, and in poor years, peasants stretched meals thin, relying on whatever could be gathered from the wild. Yet even in these hardships, the rhythm of meals was a source of comfort, for to sit together at the hearth was to affirm the strength of family and community. The obligations owed to the Lord shaped much of peasant life. A portion of crops went as rent, labor was demanded on the domain, and fees were paid for the use of mills, ovens, and presses. The presence of the steward or bailiff reminded peasants that their work was never wholly their own, but always partly for the Lord. Tithes to the church claimed another share, usually a tenth of produce, reinforcing the authority of both religion and hierarchy. These burdens left little for peasants themselves. Yet they endured them as part of the natural order, for to resist was dangerous, and to comply was survival. Religion gave meaning to their hardships. The church calendar shaped the year with holy days, fasts, and feasts, each providing a rhythm beyond the fields. Easter, Christmas, and local saints' days brought moments of relief, with processions, music, and gatherings that transformed the village with joy. The priest's sermons reminded peasants that their labor was holy, their suffering a path to heaven, their obedience a virtue. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals tied every stage of life to the church, making it the unshakable center of existence. To peasants, faith was not an abstract doctrine, but a lived reality, woven into the cycles of planting and harvesting, into the prayers spoken before meals, and into the blessings sought for fields and animals. Clothing reflected their simplicity. Wool was spun by hand, woven into tunics, gowns, and cloaks, dyed with plants when possible, but often left in natural shades of gray or brown. Clothes were patched until they could no longer be used, then cut into rags. Shoes were rare and carefully preserved, with many going barefoot through much of the year. In winter, cloaks and hoods offered some protection from the cold, though warmth often came from shared fires and shared bodies more than from garments. Appearance was not for display, but for survival, and every stitch of clothing bore the marks of labor. Life was fragile, for disease struck often, harvests failed, and famine loomed when stores grew thin. Armies passing through could strip villages bare, and lords in conflict could drag peasants into wars, not their own. Yet in spite of these dangers, peasants endured, for endurance was the essence of their existence. They tilled, they sowed, they harvested, and they repeated, generation after generation, carrying the weight of kingdoms without ever knowing the halls of power. Their names were forgotten, their stories unrecorded, but their work was the silent foundation of the Middle Ages. And so, the quiet lives of medieval peasants continued, steady as the passing of seasons, unchanging as the rise of the sun, humble but essential, a rhythm of labor and faith that sustained a world. The world of the medieval peasant was not one of castles, crowns, or knights in shining armor, but one of fields, tools, animals, and the endless rhythm of labor that tied their lives to the soil. Their existence was not measured in victories or chronicles, but in the steady repetition of tasks that had no beginning and no end. Each generation stepped into the same roles, accepted the same obligations, and endured the same hardships. And through this endurance, the foundations of medieval society were quietly upheld. The land was everything to the peasant. It fed his family, provided his obligations to the Lord, and defined his place in the community. Strips of land were divided among families, rotated through systems of planting to prevent exhaustion of the soil. Common lands provided space for grazing, while woods and rivers gave resources such as firewood, berries, nuts, and fish. The open field system demanded cooperation, for no family worked in isolation. Planting and harvesting were done together, decisions were made collectively, and disputes settled within the village or under the oversight of the manor court. The cycle of labor was so deeply ingrained that peasants rarely questioned it, for their survival depended upon it. Life within the village was as important as life in the fields. Houses clustered along narrow paths, built with timber frames filled with mud and straw, roofed with thatch, and floored with packed earth. The hearth was the center of the household, where cooking, heating, and light came from the same fire. Families gathered around it for warmth, for meals, and for conversation at the end of long days. Smoke filled the air, escaping through cracks in the roof, and soot blackened beams over time. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a rough bench, a chest, or a table, but homes were alive with voices, laughter, and the small comforts of family. Food was repetitive but sustaining. Bread formed the core of every meal, made from rye or barley, heavy and coarse compared to the lighter bread of the wealthy. Pottage simmered endlessly, with beans, peas, and vegetables forming the base, and sometimes enriched with meat or fish when available. Dairy products, eggs, and ale supplemented the diet, while fruits and herbs offered occasional variety. Meals were shared communally, eaten from wooden bowls, reinforcing the sense of unity within families. Hunger, however, was a constant shadow, and in poor harvest years, peasants stretched meals thin, relying on whatever could be gathered from hedgerows or forests to survive until the next crop. The obligations to the Lord weighed heavily. Labor was owed on the domain, where peasants worked the Lord's land without pay. Fees were required to use his mill, his oven, or his winepress, and rents were paid in crops or animals. Tithes to the church took another portion, leaving peasants with only what remained for themselves. Yet these duties were accepted, for the manor system was the framework of life, and peasants depended on the Lord's protection and the community's support. Resistance was rare, for the risks were too high, and obedience was reinforced by both custom and the teachings of the church. Religion gave peasants meaning and comfort. The village church was the most enduring structure in their lives, its bells marking the passage of time, its services providing guidance and solace. Holy days punctuated the monotony of labor, offering rare moments of rest, feasting, and celebration. Easter, Christmas, and Saints' Days filled the village with processions, music, and games. Brief interruptions in the endless cycle of toil. Priests preached patience, humility, and the promise of heaven, reminding peasants that their suffering on earth was part of God's plan and that obedience would be rewarded in the afterlife. Clothing was modest, made from wool spun and woven in the home. Men wore tunics and hose, women wore gowns and aprons, and children wore smaller versions of the same garments. Cloaks and hoods offered warmth, while shoes were rare and carefully preserved. Whose clothing was in muted colors, patched and reused until no longer serviceable. Appearance mattered little, for survival mattered most, and every thread bore evidence of labor and necessity. Life was fragile, for disease, famine, and war were constant threats. Plagues swept through villages with terrifying speed, poor harvests brought hunger, and armies passing by left devastation in their wake. Yet peasants endured, for endurance was their only strength. They continued to till, to sow, to harvest, and to pray. Their persistence ensuring the survival not only of their families, but of the kingdoms that depended upon them. Though their names are largely forgotten, their labor was the silent foundation of the Middle Ages, and their quiet lives, though humble, were indispensable to the survival of their world. As the story of medieval peasants draws to its quiet conclusion, it becomes clear that their lives, though rarely celebrated, were the backbone of their age. Without their constant labor, the castles of lords, the cathedrals of bishops, and the armies of kings could not have been sustained. Yet their existence remained humble, repetitive, and largely unrecorded, marked more by survival than by achievement, more by continuity than by change. To live as a peasant was to accept the authority of the manor, the teachings of the church, and the demands of the land, and within these boundaries, life unfolded in cycles that seemed eternal. Each day began with the dawn, as men walked to the fields with plows and hoes, women tended hearths, gardens, and children, and the youngest carried water or gathered wood. Work filled every hour from the rising of the sun to its setting, and when the light faded, families gathered around the hearth for meals of bread, pottage, and ale before sleep claimed them. The houses they lived in were small, smoky, and fragile, yet they were filled with the warmth of family and the familiarity of shared life. The seasons gave structure to their year. Spring meant plowing and sowing, summer meant weeding and tending, autumn meant harvest, and winter meant mending and waiting. These tasks never changed, repeating endlessly so that a peasant's life could be described not as a journey forward, but as a circle, a constant return to duties that had been performed by parents and grandparents before, and would be passed down to children and grandchildren after. There was little hope of rising beyond the circle, but within it there was stability, and in that stability, peasants found meaning. The obligations to the Lord were a heavy burden. Days of labor on the domain, portions of crops paid as rent, fees for mills and ovens, and tithes to the church left peasants with only a share of their own harvest. Yet they accepted this as the natural order, reinforced by tradition and by religion, which taught that obedience was a virtue and suffering a path to salvation. The church stood at the center of their existence, its bells marking the hours, its festivals marking the seasons, its priest offering guidance in matters of life and death. Faith provided comfort in hardship, explaining famine and disease as trials within God's plan, and offering the hope of eternal rest beyond earthly toil. Community gave strength. Villages worked together at harvest, shared tools and animals, and supported one another in times of hardship. Weddings brought days of feasting, music, and dancing. Funerals brought solemn gatherings, and holy days brought processions, games, and joy that broke the monotony of labor. These moments, though rare, were cherished, for they reminded peasants that life was not only toil, but also connection, not only endurance, but also fellowship. Clothing remained simple, spun and woven from wool, patched until no longer wearable, and shoes were scarce, worn sparingly. Meals were plain, often the same day after day, but shared meals bound families together. Illness and hunger were constant threats, yet the resilience of peasants ensured the survival of their households and, by extension, the society that depended upon them. Their names did not appear in chronicles, their deeds were not carved into monuments, but their presence was felt in every loaf of bread, in every field of grain, in every stone raised by workers who depended on their harvest. In silence and humility, peasants carried the weight of kingdoms, their labor invisible yet essential. And so the quiet lives of medieval peasants passed, generation after generation, unchanging yet enduring, humble yet indispensable. They lived and died close to the land, bound by duty, guided by faith, and sustained by community. Their story is not one of glory, but of persistence, a reminder that history is not only made by kings and warriors, but also by those who worked the fields, tended the animals, and endured the endless rhythm of labor. Their contribution was not in monuments or battles, but in the steady survival of society itself. In their quiet strength lay the foundation of the Middle Ages, a strength that, though overlooked, was the truest measure of endurance. And so, our story has come to an end. Before we begin the next tale, I kindly ask you for 1 like and 1 subscribe, so you can continue to join us on these quiet nights. Now, let us move forward in our series of boring history for sleep, with the story of daily life in a Byzantine monastery. And so, our story has come to an end. Before we begin the next tale, I kindly ask you for 1 like and 1 subscribe, so you can continue to join us on these quiet nights. Now, let us move forward in our series of boring history for sleep, with the story of daily life in a Byzantine monastery. In the long centuries of the Byzantine Empire, beyond the noise of cities, the bustle of markets, and the disputes of courts, there existed a quieter world, a world shaped by stone walls, cloisters, and the unending rhythm of prayer. This was the world of the Byzantine monastery, where monks withdrew from ordinary life to dedicate themselves to God, to prayer, and to labor. The monastery was not a place of excitement or grandeur, but of order, repetition, and silence, where each day followed the same pattern as the one before, and where the cycles of worship and work were seen as eternal reflections of divine order. To step into such a monastery was to step into a space removed from the world, a place where time seemed to move slowly, measured not by hours of commerce or politics, but by the ringing of bells that called the monks to prayer. A Byzantine monastery was often located far from towns, set in valleys or on hillsides, sometimes near the sea, sometimes deep in mountains. High walls enclosed the community, offering both protection and separation. Inside those walls stood the central church, around which all life revolved, along with cloisters, refectories for meals, dormitories for rest, storerooms, workshops, gardens, and sometimes libraries, where manuscripts were copied and preserved. The architecture was plain compared to palaces or cathedrals, but it was functional, designed for endurance and reflection rather than display. The daily life of monks was ruled by a strict schedule known as the horologion, a set of hours marked by prayers and services. The day began before dawn, often in darkness, when bells or wooden sumantra called the monks from their beds. They gathered in the church for the first prayers, voices chanting psalms in low, measured tones, the flicker of oil lamps casting shadows on stone walls. After the service, they returned to their cells or to work, until the next prayer brought them back together. In total, there were multiple services each day and night, dividing time into sacred intervals. Each service was nearly the same as the last, creating a sense of continuity, where hours flowed into one another not with change, but with repetition. Work filled the spaces between prayers. Monks labored in gardens, cultivating vegetables, fruits, and herbs that sustained the community. Others tended vineyards or olive groves, producing wine and oil. Some cared for animals such as goats, sheep, or chickens. In workshops, monks wove cloth, made candles, or carved wood. In scriptoria, skilled hands copied manuscripts, preserving religious texts, classical works, and histories. Each task was part of the monastery's self-sufficiency, for monks lived apart from the world and needed to provide for themselves. The work was steady and unvaried, performed with the intention that even labor could be a form of prayer, a way to discipline the body and focus the mind on God. Meals were simple and taken in silence. The refectory was a long hall with wooden tables and benches where monks sat together as one community. Bread, vegetables, lentils, and occasionally fish formed the diet, with wine or water to drink. Meat was rare, often forbidden except in cases of illness. Meals were eaten quickly, while one monk read aloud from scripture or from the lives of saints, reminding everyone that even eating was to be done with mindfulness and devotion. After the meal, the monks offered prayers of thanksgiving before returning to their duties or their studies. Their clothing was equally plain, consisting of simple woolen habits, usually dark in color, with hoods or cowls for warmth. The garments were coarse but durable, made not for display but for humility and endurance. Sandals or simple shoes were worn, though in many monasteries, monks went barefoot inside. The appearance of the community reflected its values: simplicity, humility, and detachment from worldly vanities. Silence was central to monastic life. Conversation was minimal, restricted often to what was necessary for work or for worship. Silence was seen not as emptiness but as discipline, a way of turning attention inward and upward. Within the monastery walls, the absence of noise allowed the chanting of prayers, the rustling of pages, and the tolling of bells to dominate the senses, reinforcing the idea that the monastery was a place set apart, a place closer to the divine. And so life in a Byzantine monastery unfolded slowly, without drama, without haste, without change. The same bells rang each day, the same psalms were sung, the same tasks repeated. Generations of monks lived and died within the same walls, walking the same cloisters, tending the same gardens, reading from the same scriptures. Their names were rarely remembered, their deeds rarely recorded, but their persistence preserved knowledge, sustained faith, and offered a model of endurance. To live in such a place was to surrender individuality for community and to accept that the quiet repetition of daily tasks was itself a form of devotion. The life of monks in a Byzantine monastery was not lived in pursuit of change or novelty, but in the quiet acceptance of repetition. For repetition was seen as the pathway to discipline, and discipline as the pathway to holiness. Each day unfolded with the same rhythm, the same sequence of prayer, work, and rest, until time itself seemed to dissolve into an endless cycle of devotion. To the outside world, this existence may have seemed austere, even harsh, but to those who lived within the monastery walls, it was a life of purpose, a life stripped of distraction, a life that sought eternity rather than fleeting moments. The monastery functioned as a self-contained world, a microcosm where everything needed for survival was found within its walls or its surrounding lands. Gardens were planted with beans, onions, cucumbers, and herbs, providing steady supplies of food for the refectory. Orchards grew figs, pomegranates, and apples, while vineyards and olive groves supplied wine and oil. Beehives provided honey and wax, goats and sheep gave milk and wool, and chickens laid eggs. The work was steady and unvaried, yet it ensured that the community did not rely too heavily on the outside world. Each monk contributed to this labor, for no one was exempt from work, regardless of education or skill. Even those who copied manuscripts or studied theology took turns in the gardens or kitchens, reinforcing the idea that humility and service were at the heart of monastic life. The spiritual rhythm of the monastery was structured by the canonical hours, the cycle of daily services that divided time into sacred portions. Before dawn, the monks gathered for orthros, the morning prayer, chanting psalms and hymns in low voices, their words rising like incense into the dark. At intervals throughout the day came further services: terce in mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, compline before rest, and even prayers in the middle of the night. Each service was nearly the same as the one before, a repetition of scripture, hymns, and psalms, but it was this very sameness that created a sense of eternity. In the repetition of prayer, time seemed to lose its hold, and the monks felt themselves closer to the divine order. Between these services, monks labored quietly. In the scriptorium, Those trained in letters sat at wooden desks, carefully copying manuscripts. Pens cut from reeds dipped into ink made from soot or plants, tracing letters in precise rows across parchment. Margins were often decorated with simple designs, and great care was taken, for each word was sacred and each page a lasting offering. These manuscripts preserved not only religious works, but also texts of philosophy, science, and history, ensuring that knowledge endured even when the world beyond the monastery fell into turmoil. In the workshops, monks carved wood, repaired tools, made candles, or wove cloth, their hands moving with patient repetition, their silence broken only by the creak of tools or the crackle of fire. In the refectory, meals were plain and silent. Bread baked from the monastery's grain formed the basis of the diet, eaten with beans, lentils, olives, and vegetables from the gardens. Wine was drunk sparingly, and meat was largely absent, though fish might be eaten on special days. Meals were short, for eating was seen not as indulgence, but as necessity. And during the meal, one monk would read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints, reminding everyone that even nourishment of the body must be accompanied by nourishment of the soul. Afterward, prayers of thanksgiving were offered before the monks returned to their duties or studies. Clothing reflected humility. The dark woolen habit, simple in form, was worn daily, a sign of detachment from the vanity of the world. A belt at the waist, a hood or cowl for warmth, and sandals on the feet completed the attire. Clothes were mended repeatedly, patched and worn until they could no longer serve. There was no distinction of fashion or decoration, for all were equal in their vows, and outward appearance mattered only as a reflection of simplicity and humility. Silence pervaded the monastery. Conversation was limited to what was necessary for work, and even then voices were kept low. The silence was not empty, but purposeful, teaching discipline of the tongue and focus of the mind. In this silence, the chanting of prayers became all the more powerful, filling the church with a sense of sacred stillness. The sound of bells, the scrape of pens, the shuffle of sandals on stone floors, the distant crowing of roosters. These were the sounds of monastic life, steady, unchanging, and eternal. And so, the monks of a Byzantine monastery lived each day not as individuals seeking their own ambitions, but as members of a community seeking the eternal. Their world was narrow, their tasks repetitive, but within that narrowness lay a vast depth of devotion. They worked, they prayed, they endured. Their names may not be remembered, their lives may not have been recorded in chronicles, but their persistence preserved faith, preserved knowledge, and preserved a way of life that endured for centuries. The monastery of the Byzantine world was not only a place of prayer and work, but also a place of order, where every moment of the day was shaped by rules and customs that left little room for chance. These rules, sometimes called the typikon, set the rhythm of life, ensuring that every monk followed the same schedule, wore the same clothes, ate the same food, and observed the same silences. To outsiders, such a life might have seemed rigid, but to those who lived within the monastery walls, the predictability was a form of peace, for in repetition the mind was quieted, and in quiet the soul could turn toward God. The day began before the first light, when the wooden semantron was struck, its hollow sound echoing across the courtyard. Monks rose from their narrow beds, wrapped themselves in their habits, and moved silently toward the church. The first prayers of the day were long and slow, psalms and hymns chanted in unison, voices blending in low tones that filled the dimly lit space. Candles and oil lamps flickered against stone walls, illuminating icons painted in rich but worn colors. The service concluded, and monks filed out again into the cool air, dispersing to their duties until the next bell called them back. Work was divided according to the needs of the community. Some monks went to the gardens to tend rows of beans, onions, or herbs, pulling weeds with steady motions. Others went to vineyards, trimming vines or gathering grapes in season. Olive groves needed care, and beehives demanded attention, with honey carefully collected and wax stored for candles. In the workshops, monks carved wood into tools, bound books, or prepared ink and parchment for the scriptorium. There, scribes bent over desks, pens scratching steadily across pages, copying texts that preserve scripture, commentaries, and even works of medicine, philosophy, and history. Their work was slow, requiring patience and precision, for each word had to be clear, each line measured, each page free from error. To copy a single manuscript could take months, even years, yet it was work that connected the monastery to eternity, ensuring that knowledge would survive beyond the walls. Meals were taken in silence, with monks seated along wooden benches in the refectory. The food was plain, bread and vegetables, lentils or beans, olives or figs, and on rare occasions fish. Wine was allowed in moderation, but meat was forbidden in most communities, except in times of illness. One monk read aloud from scripture, while the others ate, his voice echoing in the hall, reminding everyone that even this simple act of nourishment was to be done with mindfulness. When the meal was over, prayers of thanks were offered, and the monks rose again to return to their work or to prepare for the next service. Clothing was plain and unchanging. The habit, a long woolen garment often dark in color, was worn daily, fastened at the waist with a belt. Over it, a cloak or hood could be added for warmth, and sandals or simple shoes covered the feet. Garments were patched and mended repeatedly, often lasting many years before being replaced. There was no individuality in dress, for the habit symbolized equality and humility, stripping away vanity and binding the monks together as one community. The silence of the monastery was not absolute, but it was profound. Monks spoke when necessary, but conversation was brief and measured. The emphasis was on inner quiet, on listening more than speaking, on using words carefully and sparingly. This silence gave weight to the sound of bells, to the chanting of psalms, to the scratching of pens, to the creak of wooden doors. Life within the monastery moved at a slower pace than the world outside, but it was a pace that carried with it a sense of timelessness, as if each day was less an event than a reflection of eternity. Nights were marked by prayer as much as by rest. After Compline, the monks retired to their cells, narrow rooms with little more than a bed and a cross. Some slept deeply, weary from the day's labor, while others kept vigil, rising in the darkness to offer private prayers. In the middle of the night, bells might ring again, calling all back to the church for more psalms, a reminder that even sleep was not an escape from devotion, but part of the rhythm of worship. And so, the cycle of prayer and work, silence and labor, rest and devotion continued. Days turned into months, months into years, yet within the walls little seemed to change. Generations of monks lived and died in the same cloisters, walked the same paths, tended the same gardens, and copied the same texts. Their names were forgotten, their individual lives faded into obscurity, but their persistence endured. The monastery stood as a place outside of time, a world where the ordinary became sacred, and where the quiet lives of monks preserved both faith and knowledge for centuries to come. The life of a Byzantine monastery was not only shaped by prayer and work, but also by the structure of discipline, for every monk who entered its gates was expected to surrender his own will to the order of the community. This surrender was expressed through the typikon, the monastic rule that guided each monastery, setting out when prayers were to be said, how meals were to be taken, what clothing was to be worn, and how silence was to be kept. These rules varied somewhat between monasteries, but all emphasized humility, obedience, and the rejection of worldly desires. To live in a monastery was to live in submission, where the self gave way to the community, and the community gave itself to God. Daily life was measured by the ringing of bells or the striking of wooden samantra, which echoed through courtyards at appointed hours. Before dawn, monks left their cells and moved silently toward the church for orthros, the morning service, where psalms were chanted in low voices and the air was filled with the soft glow of oil lamps. After this came work, as each monk turned to his assigned duty, some in the gardens, tending to vegetables and herbs, others in orchards or vineyards, still others in workshops, weaving cloth, carving wood, or making candles. The scriptorium remained one of the most important places, for the careful copying of manuscripts preserved sacred writings and knowledge from earlier centuries. Pens made of reeds dipped into ink traced lines across parchment, each letter formed with patience and discipline, and mistakes carefully scraped away to maintain the purity of the text. Meals were taken at set times, usually twice a day, and were always simple. Bread formed the staple, with beans, lentils, and vegetables providing variety. Olive oil and wine, produced within the monastery, accompanied the meals, but meat was rarely seen, for it was considered indulgent and unnecessary. Fish might be eaten on certain feast days, but otherwise, the diet remained plain. Meals were consumed in silence, with only the voice of a reader breaking the quiet, reciting passages from scripture or the lives of saints. Eating was not meant to be a pleasure, but a necessity, a way to sustain the body so that it could continue in prayer and labor. Afterward, monks returned to their tasks, each hour marked by prayer, each day blending into the one before. Clothing was as plain as the meals, designed to strip away vanity and emphasize equality. The habit, a long woolen robe, was dark in color, often black or brown, and worn with a belt at the waist. Over it, a cowl or hood provided warmth, while sandals or simple shoes covered the feet. These garments were not replaced frequently, but patched and repaired until they could no longer be worn. To dress in such a manner was to declare one's renunciation of worldly status and wealth, to accept humility as a constant companion. Silence pervaded the monastery, not absolute but profound. Conversation was limited to necessity, and voices were kept low. Silence was considered a form of discipline, a way to guard against sin, and a method of turning attention inward. Within this silence, the smallest sounds, the tolling of bells, the chanting of prayers, the scratching of pens, the rustle of robes, took on a weight of their own, reminders that the monastery was a place apart from the world, a place set aside for devotion. Nights were not wholly given to rest. After Compline, the final prayer of the evening, monks retired to their cells. Yet even in the darkness, some rose to keep vigil, praying quietly by the light of a single lamp. At appointed hours, the community gathered again in the church for nocturnal prayers, voices chanting in the stillness of night, until they returned once more to sleep. This pattern repeated without end, days flowing into nights, nights into days, without interruption, without haste, without change. Within the monastery walls, time seemed to lose its meaning, for the cycle of prayer and work was seen as a reflection of eternity itself. Generations of monks lived and died in this rhythm, their names forgotten, their faces unrecorded, yet their presence endured in the manuscripts they copied, the walls they built, the gardens they tended, and the prayers they offered. The monastery was not a place of history's great events, but a place of quiet persistence, where faith was preserved, knowledge safeguarded, and devotion lived out in silence. And so the daily life of a Byzantine monastery continued, steady and unchanging. A world of repetition and order, where the ordinary was transformed into the sacred, and where monks sought eternity not through glory, but through humility, obedience, and endurance. Within the walls of a Byzantine monastery, the passing of time was not marked by novelty or change, but by the unbroken rhythm of prayers, meals, and labor that gave the community its shape. For the monks who lived there, each day mirrored the last so closely that weeks, months, and even years could flow into one another. And yet this sameness was not seen as a burden, but as a blessing, for it reflected the eternal constancy of God. The monastery was a world set apart, close to the distractions of politics, war, and commerce. And in this separation, the monks found a life of order, humility, and devotion. The church remained the heart of the monastery, the place where all life began and ended each day. Before dawn, when the sky was still dark, monks were roused by the striking of the wooden cimatron, its hollow sound echoing across the stone courtyard. They filed silently into the church for the morning service, Orthros, where psalms were chanted in slow, measured tones. The air was filled with the scent of incense, smoke curling upward as oil lamps flickered against painted icons of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints. When the service ended, the monks dispersed, returning to their duties until the next bell called them back. This cycle of prayer and dispersal repeated throughout the day, ensuring that every hour was touched by worship. Work was as essential to monastic life as prayer. In the gardens, monks bent to tend vegetables, pulling weeds with patient hands, watering plants from clay jars, and harvesting beans, onions, and cucumbers when they ripened. Vineyards and olive groves required careful attention, for wine and oil were staples of monastic diet and offerings. Beehives lined the edges of orchards, their honey harvested slowly, their wax stored for candles that lit the church. In the workshops, monks labored with equal patience, weaving cloth on wooden looms, making rope, carving wood into tools, or repairing the walls of their buildings. In the scriptorium, scribes worked by the light of narrow windows, pens scratching steadily on parchment, letters carefully formed, mistakes carefully scraped away. Each page was a work of devotion, not simply a preservation of words, but an offering of time and effort to God. Meals were brief and silent, taken in the refectory, where long wooden tables filled the hall. Bread was the foundation, accompanied by vegetables, beans, olives, and sometimes fish. Wine or water was served sparingly. During the meal, one monk read aloud from scripture or from the lives of saints, reminding the community that even the act of eating was to be done in the presence of God. No idle conversation was permitted. Silence ensured that the mind remained focused. And once the meal was over, prayers of thanksgiving were offered before the monks rose again to return to their work. Clothing was simple and uniform. Each monk wore a woolen habit, plain in form and dark in color, tied at the waist with a rope or belt. Sandals covered the feet, though many went barefoot inside. Hoods or cloaks were added in winter to ward off the cold. These garments were patched and mended repeatedly, often lasting many years. The habit was more than clothing. It was a symbol of humility, of renunciation of the world, and of belonging to the monastic community. To dress alike was to affirm equality, to strip away vanity, and to live in simplicity. Silence was one of the defining features of the monastery. It was not absolute, for instructions and prayers required words, but it was profound. Monks spoke sparingly, and voices were kept low. The silence created an atmosphere of reflection, where the smallest sounds, the tolling of bells, the chant of psalms, the shuffle of sandals on stone, took on weight and meaning. For the monks, silence was not emptiness but fullness, a space where the soul could turn inward and upward. Nights were given partly to rest and partly to prayer. After the final service of the day, Compline, monks retired to their narrow cells, each containing little more than a bed, a cross, and perhaps a small stool. Some slept deeply, worn from labor, while others rose in the night for private prayer or vigils. At appointed hours, the sementron sounded again, calling the community to gather in the darkened church for nocturnal psalms. Sleep was never undisturbed, but broken and brief, another reminder that life was not for comfort, but for devotion. In this way, the monastery lived outside of ordinary time, its days and nights blending into one unbroken rhythm of worship and work. Generations of monks came and went, their names forgotten, their lives unrecorded, but the monastery endured, its walls bearing witness to centuries of prayer. In the silence of its cloisters, in the patience of its scribes, in the humility of its meals, the Byzantine monastery preserved not only the faith of its community, but also the culture and knowledge of the wider world. And so the daily life of monks continued, steady and unchanging, a reflection of eternity lived out in the quiet persistence of ordinary days. The daily rhythm of a Byzantine monastery was so steady and so carefully observed that it seemed to stand outside the changes of the world, as if the walls themselves preserved a time untouched by kings, wars, or politics. To those who entered, the monastery became a place where the only movements that mattered were the rising and setting of the sun, the ringing of the bells, and the endless cycle of prayer and labor. Every hour was accounted for, and every action, no matter how small, was performed not for personal gain, but as an offering to God. The monks rose in darkness to attend the first prayers, their footsteps quiet on stone floors, their voices rising together in chants that had been repeated for centuries. These prayers were long and slow, marked by psalms, hymns, and readings, their monotony deliberate, for the purpose was not entertainment but endurance, shaping the heart through repetition. When the service ended, they dispersed to their tasks, each one knowing exactly what was expected of him, for the order of duties rarely changed. In the gardens, monks bent to pull weeds, to water rows of beans and cucumbers, or to harvest onions and garlic. The soil was worked carefully, not with haste, but with steady hands, for the gardens provided the food that sustained the community. Vineyards stretched in neat rows, their vines pruned and tied, their fruit gathered when ripe to be pressed into wine for the table and for the liturgy. Olive trees stood in groves, their fruit collected and crushed for oil that served in lamps and in cooking. Beehives lined the gardens, their hum a constant background, their honey collected slowly, their wax stored for candles that lit the darkened church. Each of these tasks was done without complaint, for labor itself was seen as prayer, and through the discipline of the body, the soul was trained to humility. In the workshops, the work was equally repetitive. Wooden looms clattered as monks wove cloth from wool, producing habits for themselves and sometimes for the poor. Candles were poured from beeswax, rope twisted from hemp, tools repaired with care, each act carried out in silence or in low voices. In the scriptorium, the sound of reed pens scratching across parchment filled the air. Monks bent over their desks, eyes straining in the dim light, copying line after line of sacred texts, their letters uniform and steady, their progress slow but deliberate. Mistakes were rare, for every word was precious, and if errors were made, they were scraped away and corrected with care. Hours of such work produced only a few pages, but across years and decades, these efforts preserved the learning of past generations, ensuring that knowledge would not vanish even as empires rose and fell. Meals brought the community together again in the refectory, but even here, the mood was one of silence and devotion. Bread, beans, vegetables, olives, and wine formed the simple fare, sometimes with fruit in season, sometimes with fish on special days, but always with moderation. No laughter, no idle chatter, no indulgence accompanied the meal, only the voice of a reader, chosen to recite scripture or the lives of saints while the others ate in silence. The sound of chewing, the clatter of bowls, and the measured voice of the reader were the only interruptions in the stillness. When the meal ended, a prayer of thanksgiving was offered, and the monks returned again to their duties. Clothing was never a matter of fashion, only of necessity. The woolen habit, dark and plain, hung heavily around the body, fastened with a rope at the waist. Sandals covered the feet in summer, while in winter, heavy cloaks were added to guard against the cold. Garments were patched repeatedly, and habits might last years before being replaced. To wear such clothing was a sign of humility, stripping away vanity and declaring equality. No monk stood above another in appearance, for all were bound to the same vow of simplicity. Silence remained central, guiding not only the tongue but also the heart. To hold one's words was to learn patience, to avoid sin, and to deepen focus. In this silence, the faintest sounds carried weight. The toll of the semantron calling to prayer, the echo of chants within the church, the scrape of tools, the rustle of robes. For the monks, silence was not absence but presence, a space filled with awareness of God. As night fell, the cycle continued. After Compline, monks retired to their cells, narrow rooms with only the barest furnishings. A bed of straw, a cross on the wall, perhaps a stool or a lamp. Some slept deeply, weary from the day, while others remained awake, keeping vigil in prayer. At intervals, the bells or semantron called them again to the church, where psalms were chanted under the dim light of oil lamps, until they returned once more to rest. Thus the night mirrored the day, both filled with prayer and silence. And so the life of a Byzantine monastery carried on, each day indistinguishable from the last, each action repeated endlessly, each moment offered as devotion. Generations of monks passed through the same cloisters, their names forgotten, their lives unrecorded, yet their persistence endured in the manuscripts they copied, the prayers they whispered, the gardens they tended, and the silence they kept. Their world was narrow, but within its boundaries lay eternity, a reflection of heaven on earth, lived out in the quiet strength of daily repetition. To remain within the walls of a Byzantine monastery was to live a life of deliberate separation from the world, a life that rejected the noise of cities, the wealth of courts, and the struggles of politics, choosing instead a narrow but steady path marked by repetition. The monks who lived there did not seek fame or recognition, but sought to erase the self through prayer, humility, and labor. Their days were shaped by the same cycle that had guided their predecessors and would guide their successors. A cycle of bells, prayers, meals, and tasks that created a sense of eternity within ordinary time. The monastery itself was arranged to support this life of order. At its center stood the church, where prayers were held day and night, its icons illuminated by oil lamps, its walls filled with chants that echoed endlessly. Around the church lay the cloisters, shaded walkways, where monks moved silently between dormitories, refectories, workshops, and gardens. Each building had a purpose, each space a role, and together they formed a self-contained world. The high walls separated the monastery from the outside, not only for defense, but for symbolism, marking a clear boundary between the life of devotion inside and the distractions left behind outside. The rhythm of the day was unchanging. Before dawn, the semanantron sounded, and monks gathered for orthros, chanting psalms in low voices as incense rose into the dark. When the service ended, they dispersed to their tasks, only to gather again at terce, at sext, at none, at vespers, and at compline. Between these services they labored steadily, not with haste or urgency, but with the patience of those who believed that every task, however small, was sacred. The gardens were cultivated with care, providing beans, lentils, onions, cucumbers, and herbs. Orchards bore figs and pomegranates, vineyards yielded grapes for wine, and olive groves supplied oil for lamps and food. Beehives lined the walls, their honey harvested slowly, their wax used to make candles. Livestock such as goats and sheep gave milk and wool, while chickens provided eggs. In this way, the monastery was largely self-sufficient, a community that sustained itself without reliance on the uncertainties of the outside world. In the workshops, monks worked with equal diligence. Some wove cloth on wooden looms, producing habits for themselves and sometimes for those in need. Others carved wood, bound books, or made candles. In the scriptorium, scribes labored over parchment, their reed pens scratching steadily as they copied texts, letter by letter. The work was slow, demanding concentration and patience, but it preserved not only the sacred scriptures, but also the knowledge of earlier generations. The manuscripts they produced, though plain, were treasures of endurance, ensuring that wisdom did not vanish even as centuries passed. Meals were taken in silence, the refectory filled with long wooden tables where monks sat side by side. Bread, beans, olives, and vegetables formed the daily fare, with wine served in moderation. Meat was almost never eaten, except in illness, and fish was reserved for certain feast days. During meals, one monk read aloud from scripture, reminding the community that eating itself was an act to be performed in the presence of God. No words of casual conversation were permitted, and once the meal ended, prayers of thanksgiving were spoken before the monks returned to their tasks. Clothing was uniform, the dark woolen habit patched and mended until it could no longer serve, the cowl and cloak offering warmth, the sandals protecting the feet. The habit was more than clothing. It was a visible reminder of vows taken, a declaration of humility and equality. Every monk looked much the same, and this sameness reflected the rejection of pride and vanity. Silence remained one of the monastery's deepest disciplines. Speech was used sparingly, and words carried weight because they were few. The silence was filled not with emptiness, but with sound made meaningful. The toll of the bell, the chant of psalms, the rustle of pages in the scriptorium, the crackle of fire in the workshops. This atmosphere of quiet shaped not only the daily routine, but also the inner life of the monks, teaching them to listen inwardly and to focus on the eternal. Night brought no release from this rhythm. After compline, the final service of the day, monks retired to their cells, simple rooms with little more than a bed of straw, a cross, and perhaps a lamp. Some slept, while others remained awake in vigil, whispering prayers into the silence. At intervals, the semanantron called them again to the church, where psalms were chanted under the glow of oil lamps. Sleep was never deep, never long, for even in the night devotion continued. And so the days of the monastery flowed endlessly, each resembling the last, each shaped by prayer and work, each a reflection of eternity. Generations of monks lived and died within these walls, their names forgotten, their lives unrecorded, but their persistence endured in the manuscripts they copied, the gardens they tended, and the prayers they offered. Their world was small, but in its repetition and silence, it carried a sense of timelessness, a reminder that constancy itself was a form of devotion. The monastery of Byzantium was a place where time seemed to lose its urgency, where the concerns of emperors, merchants, and soldiers faded at the gates, and where life was reduced to its simplest and most enduring patterns. Within its walls, monks lived a life of prayer, work, and silence, not seeking novelty but embracing repetition as the truest expression of devotion. Each day was divided into hours not by clocks, but by bells and by the cycle of services that had been observed for centuries. The monks did not rise to chase ambition, but to bow in humility, their lives directed by rules that guided every moment from dawn until night. Before dawn, the wooden semanantron called them to rise. and the morning service filled the church with chants of psalms. Oil lamps flickered, incense drifted upward, and voices merged into a sound that was not meant to entertain, but to endure. After prayer, monks dispersed into the cold air, some to the gardens where beans, onions, and cucumbers grew, others to vineyards or olive groves, others to workshops where cloth was woven or candles poured. Each monk had his task, and each task was carried out in silence or in low voices, for words were used sparingly, and work was considered another form of worship. In the scriptorium, scribes bent over parchment, their pens scratching lines of careful script, copying texts that preserved the wisdom of ages. Each page took hours of labor, each book years. But the monks did not measure their work in speed or efficiency. For them, the act of copying itself was sacred, an offering of patience and steadiness that carried knowledge across generations. The sound of pens on parchment, the faint rustle of pages, and the dim light filtering through narrow windows created an atmosphere of calm persistence, where time seemed to dissolve into the steady rhythm of labor. Meals were plain and silent, taken together in the refectory where monks sat at long wooden tables. Bread formed the staple, beans and lentils added nourishment, olives and figs brought small variety, and wine was served sparingly. During the meal, one monk read aloud from scripture, his voice rising and falling against the hush of chewing and the clatter of wooden bowls. The meal ended with prayer, and the monks returned to their tasks. Food was not meant for pleasure, but for necessity, sustaining the body so that the soul could continue its devotion. Clothing reflected the same humility. Habits of dark wool, patched and worn, cloaks for warmth, sandals for the feet, nothing more than what was needed. Garments were repaired until they could no longer be used, then replaced with others just as plain. To wear such clothing was to declare equality, to strip away pride, to embrace simplicity. In the monastery there was no display, no ornament, only the steady uniformity of men who had chosen to renounce the world. Silence remained constant. It was not an empty silence, but a disciplined one, teaching patience and focus. The smallest sounds carried weight. The tolling of bells, the chants of psalms, the scraping of hoes in the garden, the hum of bees near the hives. Words were spoken when necessary, but never wasted, for every voice was to be guided by humility. Within this silence, monks found space for reflection, for prayer, and for the cultivation of inner stillness. Nights continued the same rhythm as days. After Compline, the final evening service, monks withdrew to their narrow cells, each containing little more than a straw bed, a cross, and perhaps a lamp. Some slept, others prayed, and at intervals the sementron called them again to the church for nocturnal psalms. Sleep was never deep or long, for the night was broken by devotion, just as the day was filled with it. In this way the cycle never ceased, hours blending into one another, days into years, until the passage of time was measured only in the repetition of worship and work. Generations of monks passed through the same gates, walked the same cloisters, prayed in the same churches, and copied the same texts. Their names were forgotten, their faces unknown, but their persistence preserved both faith and knowledge. The Byzantine Monastery was not a place of dramatic stories, but of constancy, a place where the ordinary was made sacred through repetition, and where eternity was sought not in change, but in endurance. And so the quiet life of the monastery continued, steady and unchanging, its rhythm echoing across centuries, its silence deeper than words, its devotion stronger than time. To remain in a Byzantine monastery was to accept that life would unfold in a circle rather than a line, for nothing within its walls was designed to change. Days mirrored days, seasons mirrored seasons, and the cycle of prayer and labor created a sense that eternity itself was being lived out in small, ordinary acts. The monks who entered these communities left behind families, possessions, and ambitions, embracing instead a narrow life where humility, silence, and repetition came the pathway to holiness. To understand such a life is to imagine a place where the striking of the wooden sementron echoed before dawn, calling the community from narrow cells into the dim light of the church. There, psalms and hymns were chanted in low voices, candles flickered against painted icons, and incense drifted upward into the darkness. The service ended, and monks returned to their duties, only to gather again at the next bell. The hours of the day were divided not by the sun, but by prayer, with terce in mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before rest. In between, labor filled every moment, not rushed but steady, performed with the patience of those who saw each task as another form of devotion. The gardens and fields within monastery lands required constant care. Monks planted beans, lentils, onions, and cucumbers, tended orchards of figs and apples, pruned vineyards, and harvested olives for oil. Beehives provided honey and wax, goats gave milk, and sheep yielded wool. Every task was shared, for no one was exempt from work, and each labor was performed in silence or with minimal words. The monotony of these duties was not a burden, but a discipline, teaching humility and obedience, binding body and spirit to the same rhythm. In workshops, monks wove wool on looms, made rope, carved wood, and repaired tools. The scriptorium remained one of the most important places, where scribes copied manuscripts by hand. Pens of reed dipped into ink, made from soot or plants scratched across parchment, line by line, page by page. Mistakes were rare, for each letter was carefully formed, each word carefully measured. To copy a single book might take years, but the monks did not measure time in haste, only in devotion. In this way, monasteries preserve not only sacred texts, but also works of philosophy, history, and science, safeguarding knowledge through centuries of turmoil. Meals were taken in silence in the refectory, where monks sat side by side at long wooden tables. Bread baked from monastery grain, beans, lentils, olives, and vegetables formed the daily fare, with wine served sparingly. Meat was absent, for it was considered indulgent, though fish appeared on certain feast days. One monk read aloud from scripture, while the others ate, ensuring that even the simple act of nourishment was accompanied by reflection. When the meal ended, prayers of thanksgiving were spoken, and the monks returned to their tasks until the next bell called them once again to the church. Clothing was plain, habits of dark wool tied with rope, cloaks added for warmth, sandals or simple shoes worn when needed. Garments were patched and mended repeatedly, often lasting many years. To dress in this way was to declare equality, for all looked the same, and vanity had no place within the cloister. Silence was constant, broken only when necessary. Words were weighed carefully, spoken with restraint, for silence itself was a form of prayer. Within it, the toll of bells, the chanting of psalms, the scrape of hoes in the garden, and the scratch of pens in the scriptorium gained a weight that filled the monastery with presence. Silence was not emptiness, but fullness, a reminder that attention was to be turned inward and upward. Night followed the same rhythm as day. After compline, monks withdrew to their cells, each containing only what was needed: a bed of straw, a cross on the wall, perhaps a lamp or stool. Some slept briefly, others prayed through vigils, and in the middle of the night the sementron sounded again, calling them back to the church for nocturnal psalms. Sleep was short and broken, for the body was never to be indulged, and even in rest the cycle of prayer continued. And so the monastery endured. Generations of monks entered and died within the same walls, their names forgotten, their lives unrecorded. Yet their presence was felt in the gardens they tended, the manuscripts they copied, and the prayers they whispered. The monastery was not a place of great events or dramatic stories, but of persistence, of continuity, of repetition that reflected eternity itself. In silence, in humility, in work that seemed unending, the monks lived lives that preserved faith and knowledge for centuries. And though their stories are rarely told, their endurance became the quiet foundation of Byzantine life. As the story of life in a Byzantine monastery comes to its conclusion, it becomes clear that what defined these communities was not greatness in the eyes of the world, but constancy. A constancy so enduring that centuries passed while little within the walls seemed to change. The monastery was a place set apart, where monks abandoned the noise of politics, the pursuit of wealth, and the distractions of cities to devote themselves to a narrow but profound rhythm of prayer, labor, and silence. Each day was shaped by the same cycle: the striking of the sementron before dawn, the slow procession to the church, the chanting of psalms in low voices, the dispersal into gardens, workshops, or scriptoria, the silent meals in the refectory, the return to the church for further prayers, and finally the retreat into small, bare cells for rest or vigils in the night. This cycle was repeated endlessly, not as monotony, but as devotion, for in repetition the monks believed they drew nearer to eternity. The monastery functioned as a world unto itself, providing food, clothing, and shelter from its own lands and labor. Gardens yielded beans, lentils, onions, and cucumbers. Orchards bore figs, apples, and pomegranates. Vineyards produced grapes for wine, olive groves gave oil for lamps and meals, and beehives supplied honey and wax. Sheep and goats provided wool and milk, while chickens laid eggs. Each task required patience and cooperation, but each was embraced as a form of service. Work was not considered separate from prayer, but part of it, for to bend the body to the soil or to scratch letters across parchment was another way of disciplining the soul. In the scriptorium, manuscripts were copied by hand with painstaking care. Hours produced only a page, and months a single book, but the monks did not measure their work by speed. Every letter, every margin, every line was an act of devotion, ensuring that sacred texts, writings of the Church Fathers, and even works of history or philosophy would survive. Without such labor, knowledge might have been lost. Yet within the silence of cloisters, it was preserved for centuries to come. Meals were plain and silent, bread forming the staple, beans and vegetables offering sustenance, wine provided sparingly. Meat was absent except in illness, fish rare and reserved for feast days. During meals, a monk read aloud from Scripture or the lives of saints, ensuring that even eating was joined to reflection. When the meal ended, prayers of thanksgiving were spoken, and the monks returned to their duties until the next service summoned them again. Clothing remained simple, dark woolen habits tied with rope, patched repeatedly until they could no longer be worn, cloaks and hoods added in winter, sandals or bare feet depending on the season. To dress in such uniformity was to erase vanity, to declare equality, and to live in humility. Silence pervaded all. It was not an empty silence, but a disciplined one, where every sound carried meaning: the toll of the bell, the shuffle of sandals on stone, the chant of psalms, the scrape of tools, the rustle of pages. Words were spoken rarely, only when necessary, and in their place was reflection, prayer, and focus. This silence was not seen as deprivation, but as fullness, a way of turning inward and upward. Night was no escape from this rhythm. After compline, monks withdrew to their narrow cells, little more than straw beds and wooden crosses. But rest was broken by vigils and nocturnal psalms. The Simantron sounded again in darkness, and the community gathered once more to chant prayers beneath oil lamps and incense smoke. Sleep was short, but it was never the purpose. The purpose was devotion, discipline, and constancy. And so the monastery endured across generations. Monks lived and died within its walls, their names forgotten, their faces unrecorded, but their persistence preserved faith, preserved knowledge, and preserved a way of life that was both ordinary and eternal. They did not seek to change the world outside, yet by their steady labor and silence, they ensured that the wisdom of ages was carried forward. The monastery was not a place of drama, but of endurance, not of glory, but of humility, not of change, but of timeless repetition. Its life was a mirror of eternity lived on earth, and its quiet strength was the true measure of devotion. And so our story has come to an end. Before we move on to the next tale, I kindly ask you for 1 like and 1 subscribe, so you can continue to join us on these calm and quiet nights. Now, let us continue our series of boring history for sleep, with the story of the long trade routes of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were a people who lived along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, in a narrow strip of land that today would include parts of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Their homeland was small, rocky, and pressed between mountains and the sea, offering little room for large fields or vast armies. Yet from this narrow base, they created one of the most enduring legacies of the ancient world, not through conquest, but through trade. To speak of the Phoenicians is to speak of ships, of harbors, and of the long routes they sailed to carry goods across seas and along coasts, weaving connections between distant peoples. Their cities, such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, were not sprawling capitals like those of Egypt or Mesopotamia, but ports, busy with the loading and unloading of cargo. Narrow streets wound between houses, workshops, and temples, while docks extended into the sea, where ships of cedar wood rocked gently with the tide. The air smelled of salt, resin, and smoke, for shipbuilding and dye-making were among their most important industries. Phoenician merchants filled their ships with goods from their homeland and beyond, carrying timber from the forests of Lebanon, wine and oil from local presses, glassware, textiles, and above all, the purple dye extracted from murex shells, a dye so rare and costly that it became a symbol of royalty across the Mediterranean. Their ships, built strong and light, carried them farther than most peoples dared to travel. At first, they hugged the coastlines, moving from port to port, but as their skills grew, they ventured into open waters, linking islands, peninsulas, and distant lands with threads of commerce. Their routes stretched westward to Cyprus, Crete, and Greece, farther still to North Africa and Sicily, and eventually to Spain and beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Atlantic. Along these routes, they traded not only their own goods, but also items acquired from others, acting as intermediaries between civilizations. From Egypt, they carried grain, papyrus, and gold. From Mesopotamia, they brought textiles and spices. From Anatolia, they obtained metals such as silver and iron. From distant lands, they carried tin, essential for making bronze. Their ships became moving markets, their ports places where the goods of many cultures mingled. The life of a Phoenician merchant was not one of rest, but of movement. Ships were loaded with amphorae of oil, jars of wine, bundles of textiles, and blocks of cedar. Crews rowed and sailed along the coast, stopping at harbors to sell and exchange, then setting out again. At night, ships anchored near shore, sails furled, as merchants rested before resuming their journeys. The sea was both opportunity and danger, for storms could scatter fleets, pirates could attack, and foreign powers could demand tribute or impose restrictions. Yet the Phoenicians endured, for trade was not simply an occupation, but the lifeblood of their society. Their knowledge of navigation grew with experience. They studied the stars, noting how constellations shifted as they sailed farther from home. They observed the winds and currents, learning when it was safe to travel and when it was better to remain in port. They built sturdy ships with curved hulls and high prows, designed to handle both cargo and long journeys. By combining skill in shipbuilding with experience in navigation, they pushed their routes farther with each generation. Over time, Phoenician traders established colonies along their routes, not vast empires but small settlements where ships could rest, repair, and resupply. Carthage in North Africa became the most famous of these, a city that would later grow into a power in its own right. Other settlements dotted the coasts of Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, each serving as a link in the chain of trade. These colonies extended the reach of the Phoenicians, ensuring that their influence stretched across the Mediterranean. And so the Phoenicians, though never a great empire of armies or monuments, built an empire of trade, a network of routes that connected distant lands, carried goods and ideas, and shaped the history of the ancient world. Their ships became symbols of connection, their ports hubs of exchange, their merchants silent agents of cultural contact. Their long trade routes were not journeys of conquest, but journeys of endurance, carried out again and again, year after year, until the rhythm of their voyages became as constant as the tides. The trade routes of the Phoenicians did not arise suddenly, but were built over generations, each voyage extending a little farther, each exchange creating another link in the chain that spread across the Mediterranean. Their homeland was narrow and rocky, pressed between the mountains of Lebanon and the sea, and it could not provide the grain or wealth to sustain a large population. Trade was therefore a necessity rather than a choice, and from necessity, the Phoenicians built their legacy. Their ships, carved from cedar wood that grew in abundance in the high forests, became the lifeline of their cities. Cedar was prized for its strength and resistance to decay, and Phoenician carpenters developed skills that allowed them to build sturdy hulls, curved prows, and high sides that could withstand long journeys. Their vessels carried both oars and sails, so they could move even when the wind was against them. Merchants and sailors grew accustomed to the rolling of the sea, to the constant motion of waves, to the long hours of rowing when winds fell silent. They carried with them not only goods, but also the knowledge of winds, stars, and currents. Knowledge passed from one crew to the next, refined by experience. The routes they followed were shaped by the geography of the Mediterranean. From their home ports of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, they sailed first to nearby Cyprus, where copper was mined and exchanged for timber and wine. From there they moved to the Aegean, visiting islands such as Crete, Rhodes, and Euboea, carrying goods to Greek markets. To the south they sailed to Egypt, where the Nile Delta offered grain, papyrus, linen, and gold. The Phoenicians did not conquer these lands but connected them, serving as intermediaries, carrying Egyptian grain to Greece, Greek pottery to Egypt, and their own purple dye to both. The purple dye, made from the murex shell, became their most famous product. It was produced in small workshops near the coast, where thousands of shells were crushed to extract a few drops of liquid. The smell was terrible, but the dye was brilliant and long-lasting, a deep purple that came to symbolize royalty. Kings and nobles across the Mediterranean paid dearly for cloth dyed in this color, and Phoenician merchants carried it along their routes as one of their most valuable commodities. As their confidence grew, the Phoenicians extended their routes westward. They sailed along the coasts of North Africa, founding settlements in places where harbors were good and water could be found. Carthage, established by settlers from Tyre, grew into a powerful city that became the western anchor of their trade. From there, routes stretched to Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, lands rich in metals such as silver and tin. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, at the edge of the known world, they sailed into the Atlantic, reaching as far as the coasts of modern Morocco and possibly beyond, always seeking new goods and new exchanges. Their ships became moving markets, carrying cedar, glass, textiles, wine, oil, and dye, and returning with metals, grain, ivory, and precious stones. Each voyage was long and filled with danger, for storms could sweep across the sea without warning, and pirates lurked in hidden coves. Foreign kings could impose taxes or demand tribute, and rival merchants competed for markets. Yet the Phoenicians endured, for their lives depended on trade, and their skills at sea gave them an advantage others could not easily match. Navigation relied on observation more than instruments. The Phoenicians learned to follow the stars, using the North Star to guide them at night, and to read the winds and currents by day. They hugged coastlines when possible, but they also dared open waters, crossing from Cyprus to Crete, from Carthage to Sicily, from Spain to Africa, their routes stretching like threads across the map of the sea. Each voyage added to their knowledge, and each generation carried that knowledge farther, until the Phoenicians became known as the greatest sailors of the ancient world. Colonies anchored these routes. They were not large or heavily defended, but they provided safe harbors, warehouses for goods, and places where ships could be repaired and resupplied. Over time, these colonies grew into cities of their own, linked by trade and culture to the homeland. Carthage was the greatest, but others dotted the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and the islands of the Mediterranean. Together they formed a web of connection, ensuring that Phoenician influence extended far beyond their small homeland. And so, the long trade routes of the Phoenicians stretched farther with each passing century, carried by cedar ships, guided by stars, and sustained by the persistence of merchants who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a highway. Their world was not built on conquest, but on endurance, not on armies, but on voyages repeated again and again, until their presence was felt in every corner of the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians became known as masters of the sea because their lives depended on it, for their land was too narrow to support large populations and too rocky to yield enough grain, so they turned to the waters that lay before them and made the Mediterranean their highway. Each voyage was a careful balance of preparation and endurance, for storms, pirates, and foreign rivals made the sea a place of constant risk. Yet it also offered the promise of goods, wealth, and survival. A Phoenician port was alive with activity, its harbors crowded with ships, its streets filled with merchants and sailors, its air heavy with the smell of cedar, tar, and dye. Dock workers loaded amphorae of wine and oil, bundles of textiles, and crates of glass onto waiting ships, while merchants haggled over prices and sailors prepared sails and oars. Shipbuilders worked in nearby yards, carving cedar planks, binding them together with ropes, and sealing seams with pitch. The hum of trade filled these cities, for without trade the Phoenicians could not endure, and every man, woman, and child was connected in some way to the rhythm of the sea. The routes they traveled were long and carefully chosen. From their homeland they sailed to Cyprus, rich in copper, where merchants exchanged timber and wine for metals. From there they sailed to Crete, to Rhodes, and to the islands of the Aegean, carrying copper, cedar, and dye to Greek markets. Southward, their ships went to Egypt, where grain, linen, papyrus, and gold awaited exchange. To the west, they sailed along the coasts of North Africa, past Libya and Tunisia, founding settlements where water and harbors allowed. Carthage, born from Tyre, grew into the greatest of these, a city that in time would surpass its mother in power. From Carthage, roots stretched farther still, to Sicily and Sardinia, where fertile lands and strategic harbors provided both goods and resting places. Beyond these islands, their ships reached the coasts of Spain, rich in silver and tin, metals essential for making bronze. It was said that they even ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, touching the shores of Morocco, and perhaps even reaching the distant lands of Britain, where tin was abundant. Each of these journeys required skill in navigation. The Phoenicians used the stars, particularly the North Star, to guide their ships at night, and they learned the patterns of winds and currents that shaped the sea. By day, they watched the flight of birds and the color of the water to judge their distance from land. Their ships were designed for these journeys, sturdy yet swift, capable of carrying heavy cargo, but also light enough to travel across open waters. With curved hulls, high prows, and both sails and oars, they were adaptable to many conditions. Their sailors gained reputations as the most skilled of the ancient world, and their knowledge of the sea was unmatched by rivals. The goods they carried reflected both the wealth of their homeland and the variety of their connections. Timber from Lebanon's forests was prized for construction in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Purple cloth dyed from murex shells became a symbol of kingship and wealth, sought by nobles across the Mediterranean. Glassware, another Phoenician specialty, was carried to distant markets, while wine and oil, produced locally, filled amphorae stacked carefully in ship holds. In return, they brought back metals, grain, spices, ivory, and precious stones. Their ships were floating markets, each voyage weaving together the resources of distant lands into a single network of exchange. Colonies strengthened these routes. They were small at first, little more than harbors with storage houses, but they grew into cities that mirrored the culture of their homeland. Carthage, Gades in Spain, and colonies in Sicily and Sardinia became anchors of Phoenician presence, places where ships could resupply, where merchants could live and trade, where culture and religion spread alongside commerce. These colonies were not empires of conquest, but extensions of trade, and together they formed a chain that connected the eastern Mediterranean to the far west. The sea itself was the constant companion of the Phoenicians, both a friend and an enemy. Storms could scatter fleets, pirates could attack, and foreign rulers could impose tolls and taxes. Yet still the ships set out, for without trade the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos would wither. And so, voyage after voyage, generation after generation, the Phoenicians traced their routes across the Mediterranean, building not monuments of stone, but pathways of commerce. Their legacy was not in armies or battles, but in endurance, in the steady repetition of journeys that connected distant peoples, carried goods and ideas, and left an imprint on the history of the ancient world. The Phoenicians became known not only for their ability to sail far across the seas, but also for the way they created a web of connections between lands that otherwise remained distant from one another. Their long trade routes were not random wanderings, but carefully chosen paths that linked resources, markets, and cultures into a network that sustained their cities and enriched their neighbors. To imagine these routes is to picture the Mediterranean not as a vast divide, but as a highway, dotted with ports, colonies, and anchorages, each one tied together by the steady voyages of Phoenician ships. From their homeland ports of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, ships set out loaded with cedar wood, purple cloth, glassware, and amphorae, filled with wine and oil. They sailed first to Cyprus, where copper mines provided the metal that gave the island its name. From Cyprus, ships continued to the Aegean, carrying copper and dye to the markets of Greece. There, pottery, silver, and fine textiles were exchanged, goods that would later be carried farther afield to Egypt or to the western colonies. To the south, Egypt remained a crucial partner, for its Nile Delta produced an abundance of grain, linen, papyrus, and gold. Phoenician merchants became regular visitors to Egyptian ports, their ships carrying cedar logs prized for temple building, as well as crafted goods such as glass and jewelry. In return, they brought Egyptian resources northward, distributing them across the Mediterranean. This role as intermediaries was central to their identity. They were not conquerors, but connectors, binding together the wealth of empires through the skill of navigation. The routes extended farther west with each passing century. Along the coast of North Africa, Phoenicians founded settlements that became resting points on the long voyage toward Spain. Carthage, the greatest of these, began as a colony of Tyre, but grew into a power in its own right, eventually commanding its own trade empire. Other colonies dotted the coastlines of Libya, Algeria, and Morocco, each one chosen for its safe harbor, fresh water, and fertile surroundings. These outposts allowed Phoenician ships to sail longer distances with greater safety, linking the eastern homeland to the farthest edges of the known world. Sicily and Sardinia became important stops, rich in fertile land and minerals, and positioned strategically in the middle of the sea. From these islands, Phoenician merchants could access markets in Italy, Greece, and beyond. Colonies in these regions grew into thriving communities, blending local traditions with Phoenician culture, spreading their language, religion, and customs alongside their goods. In Spain, the riches of silver, tin, and other metals drew the Phoenicians ever westward. The colony of Gades, near modern Cadiz, became a vital center for trade, anchoring routes that stretched back across the Mediterranean. From there, merchants ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules, sailing into the Atlantic. Ancient accounts suggest they may have reached the coasts of Britain, seeking tin essential for bronze, and perhaps even farther along the shores of Africa. Whether or not these tales are entirely true, they reflect the reputation of the Phoenicians as daring sailors who were willing to go where few others dared. The goods they carried reflected both the bounty of their homeland and the diversity of their exchanges. Timber from the forests of Lebanon was shipped south to Egypt and east to Mesopotamia. Purple-dyed cloth, woven and colored in coastal workshops, became a prized luxury for kings and nobles, its rarity making it a symbol of power. Glassware, another Phoenician specialty, traveled to distant markets, while their wine and oil filled amphorae stacked neatly in shipholds. In return, their ships returned laden with grain from Egypt, metals from Spain and Anatolia, ivory from Africa, and spices from distant lands. Each voyage added to the wealth not only of their cities, but also of their knowledge, for Phoenician merchants became keepers of stories, maps, and observations that no one else possessed. Their navigation relied on the stars, particularly the North Star, which guided them across open waters at night. By day, they watched the winds, the currents, and the flight of birds. They learned the rhythm of the Mediterranean, when storms were most likely, when currents shifted, when winds blew from east to west or west to east. Their ships, designed with curved hulls and both sails and oars, could adapt to these conditions, and their crews gained reputations as the finest sailors of the ancient world. And so the Phoenicians built not an empire of armies, but an empire of routes, a web of connections stretching from the Levant to Spain, from Egypt to Greece, from Africa to the Atlantic. Their legacy lay not in monuments, but in pathways, in the steady repetition of voyages that carried goods and ideas across seas. It was through their endurance that the Mediterranean became a connected world, and it was through their ships that cultures met, exchanged, and remembered one another. The long trade routes of the Phoenicians reveal not only their skill in navigation and commerce, but also their patience. For their journeys were not quick ventures, but long cycles of preparation, sailing, exchange, and return that could take months or even years to complete. Each voyage required careful planning, as ships had to be stocked with food, water, and goods, crews chosen for their skill and endurance, and routes plotted according to the winds and currents of the season. The Phoenicians were among the first to understand that the Mediterranean was not an obstacle, but a network of passages, and they learned to treat the sea as a road, with predictable patterns that could be used to their advantage. In their home ports of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, merchants loaded ships with cedar planks, glassware, textiles, wine, and the famous purple cloth made from murex shells. Workshops near the harbors produced amphorae to carry oil and wine, and warehouses stored surplus goods until ships were ready to sail. Once prepared, the vessels left the safety of the port and followed the coastlines, moving from one anchorage to another, always watching for storms or pirates. Sailing by day and anchoring by night, they traced the curves of the Levant, Cyprus, and Anatolia before venturing toward Greece, Egypt, or farther west. Each stop along the way was a chance to trade, not only selling their own goods, but also gathering items from others to carry farther still. The Phoenicians acted as connectors, linking distant lands that might otherwise never meet. From Egypt, they carried grain, papyrus, and gold northward. From Greece, they brought pottery and silver eastward. From Anatolia, they obtained iron and silver. From Mesopotamia, spices and textiles. From Africa, ivory and exotic animals. From Spain, silver and tin. Their ships became floating markets, filled with goods from many places, and their merchants became known not only for their wealth, but for their ability to move knowledge and culture across seas. Navigation was at the heart of their success. Without compasses or charts as we know them, they relied on observation. They used the stars, especially the North Star, to guide them at night, and watched the sun's position during the day. They read the color of the sea, the shape of waves, the behavior of birds, and the smell of the wind to sense where they were and where they were going. Over time, this knowledge became second nature, passed from sailor to sailor, refined by countless journeys. To outsiders, it seemed as if the Phoenicians held secrets of the sea that no one else possessed. And in truth, their mastery of navigation allowed them to reach places others could not. Their colonies extended the reach of their routes. Carthage, founded by settlers from Tyre, became the greatest of these, a city that grew from a trading post into a powerful hub of commerce and culture. Other colonies, such as Gades in Spain, served as western anchors for their trade, while smaller settlements dotted the coasts of Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. These colonies were more than just waypoints. They became centers of Phoenician life, where language, religion, and customs were shared with local populations. Temples to Baal and Astarte rose alongside warehouses and docks, symbols of how commerce and faith intertwined. Life aboard a Phoenician ship was simple but demanding. Crews slept on deck or in cramped spaces, eating dried fish, bread, and olives, drinking water stored in jars, and sometimes wine. They worked together to row when winds failed, to raise sails when breezes allowed, and to load and unload cargo at every port. Storms were feared above all, for sudden squalls could overturn even the strongest vessel, scattering cargo and men alike. Yet despite these dangers, voyages continued, for trade was the foundation of their existence. The goods they carried enriched their homeland and ensured that Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos remained vibrant centers of wealth and culture. Their influence spread far beyond their small homeland. Through trade, the Phoenicians introduced new goods to new markets, but also new ideas. Alphabets, religious practices, artistic styles, and technologies traveled along their routes, carried by merchants as surely as by goods. They were not conquerors with armies, but they shaped the ancient world through the quiet persistence of commerce. And so the long trade routes of the Phoenicians stretched across seas, binding together distant peoples and distant lands, not with force, but with endurance. Each voyage added another thread to the web of connection, and over centuries, those threads formed a network that was as enduring as any empire. Their legacy lay not in monuments or battles, but in the steady repetition of journeys, in the skill of sailors and merchants who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a bridge. The long trade routes of the Phoenicians were not only lines across the sea, but living arteries of commerce, carrying not just goods, but also knowledge, stories, and traditions that would shape the cultures of many lands. Each voyage, though ordinary to the sailors who rowed and steered their ships, represented another step in weaving a network that spanned the Mediterranean and reached beyond. To imagine a Phoenician merchant is to picture a man standing on the deck of a cedar ship, the salt wind in his face, his eyes fixed on the horizon, while behind him, amphorae of wine, jars of oil, bundles of purple cloth, and crates of glassware filled the hold. Ahead lay ports filled with strangers, new opportunities, and familiar risks. His life was not easy, but it was steady, and it was through such lives that an entire civilization left its mark. The roots began in their homeland, where cedar wood was harvested from the high forests and dragged to shipyards where carpenters shaped planks and built vessels. From Tyre or Sidon, ships sailed to Cyprus, where copper was exchanged for timber and wine. From there they moved on to Crete, Rhodes, and the islands of the Aegean, carrying copper, cedar, and purple dye to Greek markets. They sailed south to Egypt, where grain, linen, papyrus, and gold were abundant, and where pharaohs prized Phoenician timber for temples and ships, Westward, the voyages grew longer, stretching to North Africa where Carthage rose, to Sicily and Sardinia with their fertile lands and minerals, and farther to Spain where silver and tin were mined in great quantities. From the colony of Gades, near modern Cadiz, the Phoenicians looked beyond the Pillars of Hercules, daring to sail into the Atlantic, where the coasts of Africa offered ivory and exotic goods, and where legends spoke of distant islands rich in metals. At each stop, the Phoenicians were not conquerors, but traders. They established settlements where local people welcomed their goods, and over time, these settlements became colonies, blending cultures in quiet but lasting ways. Carthage became the greatest, a city that began as an outpost and grew into a center of commerce and power, anchoring the Western Mediterranean. Smaller colonies dotted the islands and coasts, each one serving as a link in the chain, ensuring that ships could resupply, repair, and rest before continuing. The goods carried across these routes reflected both necessity and luxury. Timber from Lebanon was used in building across the Mediterranean. Glassware, shaped by Phoenician craftsmen, was prized in distant lands. Cloth dyed purple became the symbol of kingship, worn by rulers in Greece, Egypt, and Rome. Amphorae of wine and oil traveled westward, while metals such as silver and tin traveled eastward. Ivory, spices, and precious stones moved from Africa and Asia into Mediterranean markets. These exchanges created not only wealth, but a flow of culture as ideas, technologies, and customs traveled with the merchants. Navigation remained at the heart of this system. The Phoenicians studied the stars, noting how the North Star guided them across open waters. They understood winds and currents, knowing when to sail and when to remain in port. They observed the flight of birds, the color of the sea, the smell of the air, and used all these signs to guide their ships. Their vessels, with curved hulls, high prows, and both sails and oars, were designed to handle both coastal journeys and open waters. This mastery of navigation gave them an advantage few could match, and their reputation as the best sailors of the ancient world spread across civilizations. Life aboard their ships was difficult but endured with discipline. Crews rowed in long shifts, ate dried fish, bread, and olives, and drank water from jars. They slept on deck or in cramped spaces, waking to the sound of the semitron or the voice of the captain. Storms were dreaded, for sudden winds could tear sails and overturn ships, scattering men and cargo. Pirates lurked in coves, waiting to strike, and rival powers sometimes taxed or restricted trade. Yet the voyages continued, for the survival of Phoenician cities depended on them. Over generations, the rhythm of these journeys became as steady as the tides, each voyage repeating the paths of those before, each port visited again and again until it became part of a familiar circuit. And so the Phoenicians built not monuments of stone, but a network of connections, invisible yet enduring, a web of roots that bound together the ancient Mediterranean. Their legacy was not in conquest, but in endurance, in the steady repetition of voyages that brought goods, wealth, and ideas from one shore to another. In this way, the long trade routes of the Phoenicians shaped the world quietly but profoundly, leaving an imprint that lasted long after their ships ceased to sail. The Phoenicians lived not through empires of armies or monuments, but through the steady repetition of voyages that carried them across the Mediterranean and beyond. Their trade routes were the lifeblood of their civilization, stretching outward from their narrow homeland and weaving a web of connections between distant peoples. To sail with them is to picture a cedar-built ship leaving the harbor of Tyre or Sidon, its sails raised to catch the morning wind, its hold filled with amphorae of oil, jars of wine, bundles of purple cloth, and crates of glass. The crew rows steadily, oars dipping into the water with rhythmic motion, and the horizon stretches endlessly before them. Each voyage followed paths that had been sailed for generations, paths marked not by landmarks, but by the memory of sailors, by the stars that shone overhead, and by the winds that shifted with the seasons. The first destinations were often close, to Cyprus for copper, to Egypt for grain and papyrus, to the Aegean Islands for silver and pottery. From there, the voyages grew longer, extending to Sicily and Sardinia, to Spain with its silver mines, and even beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, where the coast of Africa offered ivory and gold, and legends spoke of distant islands with hidden wealth. These routes were not conquered by force, but earned by trust, by trade, and by persistence, and each port became part of a circuit that bound the Mediterranean together. Colonies secured these routes, Carthage, the greatest of them, began as a small outpost of Tyre, but grew into a powerful hub of commerce, a city where warehouses, docks, and markets served ships that sailed east and west. Other colonies dotted the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and the islands of the Mediterranean, each chosen for its harbor and resources. These settlements were not vast empires, but anchor points, places where ships could rest, repair, and resupply, where merchants could exchange goods with local peoples, and where Phoenician culture took root alongside others. Together, they created a chain that allowed the Phoenicians to extend their reach far beyond their homeland. The goods they carried reflected the diversity of their routes. From Lebanon came timber, strong and tall, prized in Egypt and Mesopotamia for building temples and palaces. From their workshops came glassware, clear and colored, shaped into vessels and ornaments. From the murex shell, they made purple dye, a commodity so rare and expensive that it became a symbol of kingship, worn only by rulers. Wine and oil filled amphorae, stacked carefully in the holds of ships, while pottery, jewelry, and textiles added to the cargo. In exchange, they brought home metals such as silver, iron, and tin, along with grain, ivory, spices, and precious stones. Their ships became floating markets, each one carrying a small piece of many civilizations, weaving them together through commerce. Navigation remained at the heart of their skill. Without compasses, they used the stars, the winds, the currents, and the behavior of birds to guide them. They learned to recognize when storms might rise, when currents shifted, when winds favored travel east or west. The North Star guided them across open waters at night, while by day they read the sea itself, its colors and movements telling them how far from land they might be. This knowledge was passed from generation to generation, refined by experience, until Phoenician sailors gained reputations as the finest navigators of the ancient world. Life on board their ships was harsh, but endured with discipline. Sailors ate dried fish, bread, and olives, drank water from jars, and sometimes wine. They slept on deck or in cramped spaces, waking to row when the wind failed, or to adjust sails when breezes shifted. Storms were feared, pirates were constant threats, and foreign rulers sometimes demanded tolls or tribute. Yet still the voyages continued, for the survival of their cities depended upon trade, and every man who sailed understood that his labor was part of something larger than himself. The influence of the Phoenicians spread not through conquest, but through persistence. Their language, their alphabet, their religious practices, and their artistic styles traveled alongside their goods, absorbed by other cultures, and leaving traces across the Mediterranean world. The Greeks adopted their alphabet and shaped it into their own. The Romans inherited much from their colonies, and countless small exchanges carried ideas from one shore to another. And so the long trade routes of the Phoenicians were not merely paths of commerce, but pathways of culture, carrying not only timber and dye, but stories, symbols, and skills. Their legacy was not carved into stone, but carried on the waves, preserved in the memory of ports, and the continuity of routes that endured for centuries. The long trade routes of the Phoenicians can be imagined as threads stretched across the wide Mediterranean, connecting coastlines, islands, and distant harbors into a vast web of exchange that endured for centuries. Unlike empires that relied on armies and fortresses, the Phoenicians relied on ships, harbors, and the steady discipline of merchants and sailors who repeated the same voyages again and again until those routes became as familiar as the shorelines of their own homeland. To understand their endurance is to picture the daily rhythm of their commerce, the preparation of ships in the harbors of Tyre or Sidon, the careful loading of amphorae filled with oil, wine, or grain, the bundling of purple-dyed cloth, the storage of glassware and timber, and the steady departure of vessels guided first by the wind and later by the stars. From their ports, they sailed first to Cyprus, where copper was abundant, exchanging timber and wine for metal. Then their ships traced the coasts of Anatolia, stopping at harbors where iron and silver could be found. Southward, they visited Egypt, where the Nile Delta offered grain, linen, papyrus, and gold, and where Phoenician timber was valued for building ships and temples. To the west, their routes extended to North Africa, where Carthage became the greatest of their colonies, anchoring trade across the Western Sea. From Carthage, their voyages branched outward, north to Sicily and Sardinia, west to Spain with its silver mines, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, where legends spoke of distant lands rich in tin and other metals. These routes required patience and skill, for navigation relied on observation rather than instruments. The Phoenicians studied the stars, using the North Star as their constant guide at night, while by day they observed the winds, the currents, and the flight of seabirds. Their ships, made of cedar, were designed to endure both calm and storm, with curved hulls that carried heavy cargo and high prows that cut through waves. Crews rowed when winds were absent and raised sails when breezes carried them forward, their movements practiced and steady, for every man on board knew his role. The goods they carried reflected both necessity and luxury. Timber from Lebanon was prized across the Mediterranean, while glassware crafted in their workshops was carried to distant markets. Purple dye, painstakingly extracted from the murex shell, was their most famous product, so costly and rare that it became the symbol of royalty. Wine and oil traveled in amphorae, while pottery, jewelry, and textiles added to their cargo. In return, their ships brought home metals from Spain and Anatolia, ivory from Africa, grain from Egypt, and spices from the East. Their ships became floating markets, weaving together the economies of many lands. Colonies supported this network. Carthage grew into the greatest of them, but others dotted the Mediterranean. Gades in Spain, settlements in Sicily and Sardinia, outposts along the coasts of North Africa. These colonies were not conquered lands, but trading posts, places where merchants could live, ships could be repaired, and goods could be stored. Over time, they became communities in their own right, blending Phoenician culture with local traditions, spreading language, religion, and art. In this way, the trade routes were not only paths of commerce, but also paths of cultural exchange. Life aboard a Phoenician ship was demanding, for sailors endured long days of rowing, short nights of sleep, and meals of dried fish, bread, and olives. Water was stored in jars, and wine provided relief during voyages. Storms were dreaded, for sudden winds could tear sails and smash ships against rocks. Pirates and rival powers posed constant threats, demanding tribute or attacking vessels. Yet voyages continued, for trade was the lifeblood of their cities, and every sailor understood his place in this enduring system. The legacy of the Phoenicians lay not in monuments or armies, but in the persistence of these voyages. Their alphabet, carried along their routes, influenced the scripts of Greece and Rome. Their goods spread widely, but so did their ideas, their technologies, and their customs. They were remembered as the finest sailors of their age, a people who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a bridge. And so, the long trade routes of the Phoenicians stretched outward like threads across the sea, steady and unchanging, repeated by generation after generation until they became part of the very fabric of the Mediterranean world. The long trade routes of the Phoenicians were more than lines drawn upon the sea. They were lifetimes of repetition, voyages carried out again and again until they became traditions passed from one generation to the next. A young sailor might begin his life sweeping the deck of a ship in Tyre, watching older men tie knots and raise sails, listening to stories of storms and distant ports. With time, he would take the oars, learning to row in unison with others, then later help to raise the mast, to steer the ship, to negotiate in markets, until finally he became a master merchant himself, guiding voyages across the Mediterranean. This continuity ensured that the routes remained unbroken, each voyage blending into the next, so that the path from the Levant to Spain or from Egypt to Greece was as well known to the Phoenicians as the streets of their own cities. These voyages were not quick but long, often lasting months, sometimes more than a year, as ships traced coastlines, stopping at harbors to rest, trade, and resupply. At each port, Phoenician merchants set out their goods: cedar timber, glassware, purple-dyed textiles, wine, and oil. In return, they accepted metals, grain, ivory, pottery, and spices. Their ships became marketplaces where the wealth of many lands mingled, and their harbors became centers of exchange where cultures met. To the Egyptians, they brought cedar and returned with grain and linen. To the Greeks, they brought papyrus and gold from Egypt and returned with pottery and silver. To the peoples of Spain, they brought textiles and returned with silver and tin. Each leg of the journey connected different regions, making the Phoenicians the intermediaries of the ancient world, binding together societies that might otherwise have remained apart. Colonies ensured the survival of these routes. Carthage stood as the greatest, but smaller colonies stretched across Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and Spain. Each one offered safe harbors, storage houses, workshops, and markets, making long-distance trade possible. These colonies were not established through conquest, but through need, as places where merchants could find fresh water, repair their ships, and wait out storms. Over time, they grew into communities of their own, blending Phoenician language, religion, and art with local traditions. They became lasting testaments to the endurance of trade, reminders that commerce could build connections as surely as armies built empires. The goods carried by Phoenician ships were as diverse as the regions they visited. Timber and purple dye were the symbols of their homeland, but glassware, jewelry, textiles, and pottery also filled their cargo holds. In return, they carried home metals such as silver, copper, and tin, essential for tools and weapons, as well as grain, ivory, spices, and precious stones. These exchanges created not only wealth, but also cultural diffusion, as technologies, alphabets, and artistic styles spread along with the goods. Navigation was the quiet art that made all this possible. Without compasses, Phoenician sailors relied on stars, winds, and currents. They knew the North Star would always point them home, and they learned the seasonal patterns of breezes that carried them eastward or westward. By day, they observed the sun's path, the behavior of birds, the color of the water, and the smell of the air. This knowledge, passed from sailor to sailor, became second nature, giving them confidence to sail where others feared. Their ships were built to endure, cedar hulls sealed with pitch, curved sides designed to cut through waves, prows raised high to meet the sea. With oars for calm days and sails for windy ones, they adapted to every condition, making long voyages possible. Life on board was demanding. Sailors worked in shifts, rowing for hours, eating dried fish, bread, and olives, drinking water stored in clay jars. Sleep was brief, taken on deck or in small spaces, interrupted by the call to work. Storms were dreaded, pirates were feared, and rival powers sometimes taxed or threatened them. But voyages continued, for trade was the lifeblood of their cities. Without it, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos could not survive. And so, voyage after voyage, generation after generation, the Phoenicians maintained their routes. Their legacy was not in battles, but in endurance, in the steady movement of ships across the sea, carrying goods, ideas, and culture. Their influence spread quietly but powerfully, shaping the Mediterranean world through commerce. In the end, the long trade routes of the Phoenicians became as enduring as stone monuments. For though their names faded, the connections they forged remained, woven into the fabric of history itself. As the long story of the Phoenician trade routes comes to its close, it becomes clear that their true achievement was not in monuments or conquests, but in endurance, in the steady rhythm of voyages repeated across centuries until they became as constant as the tides. The Phoenicians took a narrow strip of rocky coastline, pressed between mountains and sea, and turned it into the center of a network that spanned the Mediterranean. From Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, their cedar-built ships set out again and again, carrying timber, glassware, textiles, wine, oil, and purple-dyed cloth to distant ports, returning with metals, grain, ivory, spices, and precious stones. Their routes were long, stretching east to Mesopotamia, south to Egypt, west to Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic. Along these routes, they founded colonies, not vast empires, but steady anchors of commerce, each one a place where ships could rest, where merchants could trade, where Phoenician culture mingled with local traditions. Carthage became the greatest of these, a city that began as an outpost and grew into a hub of trade and power, its markets filled with goods from across the sea. Other colonies dotted the coasts, each one part of the chain that ensured voyages could continue without interruption. The life of the merchant and sailor was demanding, but unchanging. Crews rowed in long shifts, raised sails when winds allowed, loaded and unloaded cargo at every port. They ate bread, dried fish, and olives, drank water stored in clay jars, and slept on deck or in cramped quarters. Storms were feared, pirates threatened, foreign rulers imposed taxes, but voyages continued, for the survival of their homeland depended on trade. Each man understood that his labor was part of something larger, part of the great rhythm that sustained his people. The goods they carried were symbols of their reach and influence. Purple dye became the mark of kingship. glassware the pride of their craftsmen, cedar timber the backbone of temples and ships across the Mediterranean. In return, the silver of Spain, the copper of Cyprus, the grain of Egypt, the ivory of Africa, and the tin of distant lands flowed into their cities. These exchanges created wealth but also connections, weaving together cultures that might otherwise have remained apart. Ideas traveled along these same routes. Alphabets, artistic styles, religious practices, and technologies spread from port to port, carried by merchants as surely as by goods. Navigation was the hidden skill that made it possible. Without compasses, the Phoenicians used stars, winds, currents, and the behavior of birds to guide them. The North Star became their constant companion at night, while by day they read the sea itself. Their ships, strong and flexible, were built to handle both calm waters and sudden storms. Generations of sailors learned these arts from those before them, refining knowledge until it became instinct, and this mastery gave them a reputation as the finest navigators of the ancient world. Over time, the Phoenicians were absorbed into larger empires, conquered by the Assyrians, Persians, and later the Greeks and Romans. But their legacy did not vanish. The routes they sailed remained. The colonies they founded endured. The alphabet they spread became the foundation of Greek and Latin scripts. And the quiet persistence of their trade shaped the Mediterranean long after their names were forgotten. The long trade routes of the Phoenicians were not built in a day, nor destroyed in a day. They were the result of centuries of repetition, of patience, of endurance. Each voyage added another thread, and together those threads wove a fabric of connection that bound the ancient world together. And so the story of the Phoenicians is not one of battles or kings, but of sailors and merchants, of ships and harbors, of goods carried across seas and ideas carried with them. Their legacy lies in the silent persistence of trade, in the steady rhythm of voyages that turned the sea into a highway, in the quiet endurance of a people who found their greatness not in conquest, but in connection. Thank you for choosing to spend your night with Sleep Whisper. When you wake in the morning, may your day be filled with luck, peace, and success in all that you do. We look forward to meeting you again tomorrow night, here at Sleep Whisper.